Sup you sinister folks, welcome to the part 8, of What If Deku's Cursed Blood, Could You Know Reverse Death, Chapter 21 Magnus. Time to explore how our dear cinnamon roll experiences the shift from self-recrimination to actually embracing his power. However, this doesn't mean he's fully healed, merely getting better. Also, thank you again Timothy Woods, for taking the time to explain how context is important for a story. Disclaimer. What would we do without people who are able to read and understand context? A sinister request. Ichigo no Name, who had only recently officially lost the right to the name Go, realized not for the first time that she was in dire straits. Her despair at witnessing the life she'd earned through blood, sweat, and tears, though not always her own, crumbling before her at the hands of her freakish stepchild, who should have been a rotting corpse, had made her snap. In a fit of insanity she'd attempted the inconceivable. And thanks to her longtime employer's generous covert training, she'd nearly succeeded. The woman hadn't known there was a monster in the courtroom however, and that single mistake had cost her everything all over again. It wasn't fair. She'd worked for everything she'd ever had in her shitty life, ever since the week before she'd turned 4, and her quirk had manifested. Being an emitter type wasn't all it was cracked up to be when your ability was something worthless like unbutton. Her childhood had consisted of broken dreams and pitying glances, snide comments from mean-spirited classmates, and worst of all, disappointment in the eyes of her parents. It wasn't fair. When she'd turned 14, her father had, under the pretense of making her and her waste of a quirk useful, begun to introduce her to men that were appreciative of a quirk such as hers. Ichigo had run out of tears quickly after the first few of these meetings, but it had been at the end of one particular one that she'd had an epiphany. As she laid there, still wallowing in shock on top of ruffled sheets and feeling the bruises already forming on her face and stomach, she'd realized that if she didn't want what was happening to her to be her life forever, she'd need to take action. So she had. From that day forward, Ichigo had worked hard to remake herself into the most cunning, devious, and ruthless person she could. She'd played nice with her tormentors in school, winning the brainless cunts over with ease. She'd used her quirk to utterly embarrass rising competition. It turned out having your pants or skirt drop in the middle of class during a speech damaged one's reputation considerably. She'd used and abused anyone she could, however she could, to get what she wanted. She'd played classmates, seduced teachers, allied with like-minded individuals, and even paid lesser gangs to intimidate those who thought to oppose her. Nothing was below her, as she'd already started from the bottom. She'd ruled her middle school. She'd been in the running for queen of her high school. College abroad had been a challenge, but her tenacity and ruthlessness had made her a force to be reckoned with regardless. After graduating, she'd wasted no time in ruining her father, gleefully utilizing the contacts and blackmail she'd gathered over the years to their fullest potential. Throughout her scholastic career, the man had never once stopped scheduling meetings with appreciative men he'd find from who knew where. Ichigo still felt slightly cheated that he'd committed suicide after only the second sexual misconduct scandal. Nevertheless, her reputation had preceded her, and she'd eventually gained the attention of the one who'd come to be her longest-running and most profitable employer. After a rather rigorous, but unquestionably pleasant interview, Ichigo had thought she'd been set for life. It wasn't fair. Now, Ichigo found herself laid out on the bare cot of a hospital bed she'd woken up in as she waited listlessly for today's torturer to arrive. As if being thrown into a maximum security prison wasn't bad enough, now, she knew she'd do so with only one functional arm and an altogether ruined body, the one tool that had never failed her before. A flash of pain seared through Ichigo's nerves as her thoughts turned once again to the savage that had accosted her in the courtroom. The crazed Rathed M who dripped off her arm had done an incredibly thorough job of breaking her, so much so that the twitchy doctor, who'd spoken to her after she'd first woken up, had estimated that total recovery was nigh impossible now, even so soon after the initial injuries had been sustained. It wasn't fair. According to the quack, the bones of her dismembered arm had been shattered to the point they could never mend properly, making the fact the now useless limb had somehow been reattached that much more bittersweet. Ichigo had also been told the fractures her skull had sustained throughout the attack would continue to ache for the rest of her life, and it was doubtful pain medication would help too much. On top of that, her right eye constantly saw flashes and blurred, exacerbating the migraines that plagued her every waking moment. The woman wondered why the doctors even bothered securing her wrists and ankles to her bed. It wasn't fair. At least there was a laughable silver lining to her situation. According to the shit lawyer that had been appointed as her defense when her employers had failed to show another hit to Ichigo's ego, there was at least a chance that the brats who'd gotten involved in the courtroom wouldn't be able to press additional charges against her. After all, every one of the little shits had left that room in perfect health. 2 centuries was a long enough sentence anyway. It all irked Ichigo to no end. It wasn't fair. The brats would live without even a single scar to show for their efforts, while she would never fully heal from her injuries and be sent to prison for life. She couldn't even see a way to turn anything around. What could she do? Ask for house arrest? Plead to be sent to a low-security prison's medical ward as a permanent patient? Writing a book about the unfairness of her treatment probably wouldn't go anywhere. Absently, Ichigo registered the door to her room being opened, the officers standing in the hallway guarding her speaking in low tones with whoever had approached. A few brief words were said before the uniformed men allowed the newcomer to enter. By the sound the figure made, whoever it was had brought one of those rickety hospital carts with them today. It wasn't fair. Ichigo couldn't even find the strength to move her head enough to properly get a look at her guest until said person was towering over her. Once her field of vision was filled. "Well, hello there," chirped a voice that was disturbingly attempting to remain some version of feminine. "It's time for your routine cleaning, miss." The person who'd walked into the room made Ichigo simultaneously pale and flush in disgusted rage. It was another one of those cross-dressing freaks, just like her now ex-stepchild. Unlike Takeo's abomination of a son, this man was far too burly, hairy, and overall masculine to ever hope to pass as a woman. Ichigo felt her stomach turn, for once not a symptom of her ever-present migraines. She'd grown to hate people like this man. Takeo's little freak being a leading cause of her current situation, and the downfall of her hard-earned life, only added fuel to the fire. It wasn't fair. "Today we're going to change your covers too, darling," the cross-dressing nurse announced, still smiling cheerfully. The man held up a tray holding an adjustable leather gag, bandages, and a number of syringes. "You remember the process, right? And don't you worry, I've done this before." The woman in the bed fought to roll her eyes in helpless exasperation. Great. Today's torturer was this freak. Just her luck. Managing a tiny nod, Ichigo flinched as even that minute motion shot pain from her head, down her spine, to her toe. Even speaking hurt. It wasn't fair. By now, Ichigo had realized that getting any better quality medical treatment at the facility she was currently in would be next to impossible. Even her useless, reattached arm looked like a high school student had stuck it back on without any surgical know-how. All things considered, as much as she hated to admit it, at least trained monkeys weren't the ones performing this agonizing and humiliating procedure. "Alrighty, lightly bite into the gag now please," requested the burly cross-dresser stuffed into a nurse's outfit, raising the wrapped leather tool to Ichigo's mouth. As soon as she bit into it, a fat-lipped grin spread across the man's face. "Now, let's just adjust it right away so it won't fall out or hurt you now." A suppressed grunt of pain sieved through the gag as the abused nerves in Ichigo's neck lit up like a wildfire. The woman was pretty damn sure the beastly thing attending her was being far less gentle than possible. It wasn't fair. A soft knock at the door drew the attention of both Ichigo and the cross-dressing nurse. "Miss, we just received word our shift replacements are going to be late," the officer on the right said with an even voice, clearly recognizing the individual attending his prisoner. "We're thinking of going for a cup of coffee. Will you be alright all alone with the convict for 10 minutes? Ichigo fought to keep her seething emotions from showing themselves. The jab, the sarcasm, none of it escaped her. She could tell when someone was fucking mocking her, damn it. But she couldn't move. Couldn't do anything. Her injuries were better restraints than the straps tying her to her bed. It wasn't fair. Oh, don't you worry about me, sweetheart, the beastly freak shot back, acting like some flustered lady. This is going to take some time anyway. You two could even take a 30-minute break and I'd still be here when you got back. If she'd been able to speak, Ichigo would have added, that a full hour would have been fine too, the less time she spent with the straps on the better. I see, the officer replied, nodding slightly. We'll see what happens then. It shouldn't take that long though. The bear-sized cross-dresser returned to his work, Ichigo watching him as he placed his phone over the monitor tracking her vitals, checked her condition notes, and beyond a doubt did everything possible to drag out the awful suspense she felt as she waited to be moved. All of her injuries, reattached arm included, without fail caused the next step in her torture to make her scream. The gag had been added after the first time. It wasn't fair. Finally, the cross-dresser finished the normal cleaning procedures. The time had come for her broken body to be moved. Ichigo could already feel her nerves firing, anticipating the coming agony. Now then, let's take this away for a bit, the cross-dresser said, taking the emergency button from Ichigo, and say, you don't mind if I play a video while we do this, do you? It has music. The question was ludicrous, but Ichigo only allowed her eyes to finally roll in their battered sockets in answer. Having background noise to cover her screams was probably allowed by now. No one wanted to deal with a criminal like her, so who knows what they promised the freak currently taking care of her to get him down here? It wasn't fair. Oh, you're going to love it, the cross-dresser gushed, whipping out a small data stick from his pocket and plugging it into the television that had been mounted over a corner of the room. The man unmuted the device as the video began to load. This idol is my favorite ever. She made my life so much brighter. Ichigo could have cared less, but then the screen began to play. A spotlight snapped on, and a small girl with twin tails of sky blue was revealed. The girl smiled widely and began her routine, addressing the audience with a cheerful attitude and adorable demeanor. Everything the little idol said spread a message of love freely, given in self-acceptance, decrying the restraints people placed on both due to gender. Ichigo's blood ran cold. It was Takeo's freak of a son on the screen. It wasn't fair. You know. The burly cross-dresser drawled, attitude changing as his words slipped into a somber tone. It broke my heart when I heard that such an adorable little munchkin had suffered such a terrible fate. At that moment, Ichigo knew she was in more trouble than she ever had been in before. She knew this had been a possibility too, that once Masao and Lily were connected as being one and the same someone might come after her to take revenge for her part in the child's death. And now, here she was. Bound and gagged without even an emergency call button to call for help. It wasn't fair. I think if she'd told me to stop being a villain, I might have even done it. Who knows, I might have even become a heroine instead. The burly cross-dresser mused, and Ichigo felt her stomach clench, finally recognizing the face of the one who'd been caring for her. Oh well, I guess some things just aren't meant to be, huh? Ichigo trembled, there was no mistaking it. She'd never seen this villain without sunglasses before, but there was no doubt left in her mind now. Kind of like finding a handsome man who doesn't judge a woman on her physical appearance, the villain in disguise growled, a baseball bat adorned with rusty nails appearing from the shadows, or, you know, you living another day. Ichigo forced down an instinctive need to vomit. She was stuck in the same room as the villain known as Mag. And there was no way out. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. Thanks to you, my dear Lily-chan was forced to learn all about the horrors that crawl in this society's shadows firsthand, Mag said, slowly approaching the broken form of Ichigo. Tears now streamed down the woman's cheeks, and she shook fruitlessly against the bindings that held her. Thanks to you, those degenerates who dare call themselves men were allowed to defile the purest light this world had to offer. Magna ripped away whatever covering remained on Akiko, the woman whimpering through the gag in her mouth as even such jostling as that caused pain to flare throughout her body. The cross-dressing villain grinned. "I think it's only fair someone teach you what pain like that really feel like," Magn said, "and I think the lesson should take its sweet time so that you never forget it. It wasn't fair. 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 It wasn't. It would be just the luck of one Akiko no name that the officers supposedly guarding her actually did end up taking an hour-long break, their shift replacements never bothering to show. It was an additional stroke of bad luck that no one cared to check on her either until late the next day. Monday, UA High School front gate. An nondescript black SUV pulled into a curbside parking spot just shy of a block from Japan's top hero school in the east, its back doors smoothly popping open as soon as all motion had ceased. With as much confidence as he could muster, Izuku Midoriya exited the vehicle as quickly as possible, holding a hand out for the next egressing passenger. Almost immediately, the Verdanet's hand was caught, and Tsuasui made her own departure into the world. In a much less impressive manner, Izuku's three undead partners tumbled out of the SUV in a tangle of flailing limbs and biting teeth. Sighing at the sight of Tay gnawing on Saki's forearm while the blonde delinquent pulled on Lily's pigtails, the young hero in training could only silently thank the powers that be that school had finally started back up. It would be a gratifying change of pace after the turmoil his life had been thrown into over the last few days. After the news broadcast had ousted one of his quirk's most daunting abilities, and the public had gotten an eyeful of what he could do, the media hadn't stopped there. The entire weekend had been full of reporters and journalists at all levels baying for interviews, answers, and even more concerning, further demonstrations. On top of that, Izuku had had to deal with being grounded the entire time, Inko Midoriya making her displeasure at her son's reckless actions known quite clearly over an hour-long lecture. While he'd never admit it, the Verdanet had loved every minute of it, his mother acting completely normal, continuing to lighten a weight that had sat on his soul for a long time. Of course, the grounding hadn't helped in placating his Tsu-chan. Oh no. The beautiful, and rightfully angry, amphibian teen that Izuku had the privilege to call his girlfriend had extracted her pound of flesh in the form of a binding promise to never do something so thoughtless again, a massage, and lots of cuddles. That had been a brief reprieve. Izuku sighed again, mind turning back to just that morning, when the day had began as bad as it possibly could have. When he, his partners, and his mother had attempted to leave their home earlier than normal so to avoid the circus, outside their door, they'd found the performers had anticipated their plan. The flight to the Asui household had nearly turned bloody, and Izuku was certain Saki had taken potshots at a few of the more overzealous reporters more than once. Thankfully, the grounds of his wonderful girlfriend's home were forbidden land to any news correspondent who enjoyed living, and crossing the threshold under Baru's watchful eye had earned the hard-pressed family a welcome respite. After half an hour of peace, Ganma had volunteered, for good or ill, to be the one to give his daughter, and the teen with the cursed blood, a ride to school. One awkward trip later, and here they were. Holy fucking shit. Saki suddenly exclaimed as she took in the sight of Ai's massive gates, the blonde's fear and awe, clear to see in her wide-eyed gaze. You really study here? A moment of silence took the slow-moving group, the two living party members blinking at the delinquent's shock. Tay rolled her head to the side, dead maroon eyes catching bewildered Ruby. Gang nah. The simple groan somehow managed to convey equal parts honest questioning and mirthful taunting. Lily's head quickly bounced back and forth, eagerly nodding along in agreement to the sentiment. The littlest zombie's rose-colored irises shone with glee. Lily's pretty sure we already told Blondie this too, the brunette agreed, chiming in with a bright smile at the sight of the now sputtering delinquent. Flailing for some excuse that would help her save face, Saki abandoned the notion after a moment of thought and huffed, crossing her arms in indignation. The action only caused the others in the group to grin further, and in one case, groan again. "You said best hero school ever." The blonde attempted to growl, but the usual aggression in her tone was still cowed by the sight of the institution before her. That could have meant any 2-bit school in Japan for all I knew. Unfortunately for the undead delinquent, there was no better hero school than UA. Sticking her nose up at her new comrades, Saki continued walking forward with as much dignity as she could retain. As she strode forward, the blonde zombie girl finally had to admit it to herself. Her new boss was the definition of badass. She'd heard of his heroic attitude, and witnessed it the day of the court clusterfuck, but this. Even as she stepped ever closer, the idea that a hero school like of all places had accepted the verdict blew her mind. Her boss's quirk, his individuality, it wasn't pretty. It wasn't combative or flashy in the traditional sense, and more importantly, it easily fell within the darker spectrum of powers. Saki had learned at a young age how quick their shitty society was to label its people based on abilities they had no choice in wielding, for better or, more oftentimes, for worse. Those with weak quirks were looked down on, sure, but those with quirks that involved conventionally dark themes were almost always regarded as villains in the making, regardless of the person's actual personality or actions. The fact that a world-famous hero school like UA had accepted her boss in spite of this was mind-blowing. Unbelievable. "Well, if you want to stick around, you'll have to attend with me," Izuku reminded, waving at Genma as he pulled away and headed to work. "Otherwise, you're free to wait at home until your time is over." Kindly spoken, the words weren't a threat in any way, not by any stretch of the imagination. The green-haired teen was comfortable with the idea of the blonde joining his group at this point, especially considering who her father was and how effective she'd shown herself to be in combat. However, that didn't mean he was going to force her to join a path she didn't wish to walk down. Freedom of choice worked both ways, damn it. "I'm sure Tae-chan would be more than happy to speed things up for you, Karo," Sa added as she slipped her arms around Izuku's left side, slightly leaning against her boyfriend as she did so. The action was almost instinctive for the frog girl after everything that the two had been through already. "Isn't that right?" Tae groaned in agreement as she shuffled forward and quickly slid to her master's right side, shadowing him, like a bodyguard. Not to be left out, Lily buzzed forward childishly and took Izuku's free hand for her own as the four walked by the stunned blonde. "What do you mean, of course, you useless fucking bag of skin and bones?" Saki roared, outraged at the boldly unspoken affirmation of her undead sister. "You can't even articulate a single goddamn word." As she tore after her boss, his girl, and her fellow zombie girls, Saki wondered to herself what kind of people could possibly attend the same school as the teen that had changed her world. Surely the students of such a famous school were as badass as her boss? Right? Later, UA High School, 1A homeroom. They were not. Izuku-kun. Kyauu Kajiro was, unsurprisingly enough, the first to approach the budding necromancer as soon as he and his entourage had entered their classroom. Shadowing the rocker girl, quite literally, was the raven-headed Fumikage Tokoyami. Both members of the gothic rock duo held looks of deep concern for their mutual friend. Are you alright? For once, Saki didn't scoff. The blonde refused to fault brats who showed concern for her boss. In a way, they reminded her of her old gang, always looking out for their leader. "My friend," Fumikage began solemnly, unaware of how far Izuku had gone in an attempt to downplay his survival. "Victory aside, the sheer severity of your injury no doubt left you with terrible scarring of the soul if not the flesh. Please, if you ever find yourself in need, call upon us and we will be there." Okay, that was a bit much for the delinquent girl, but if her boss could act like a cinnamon roll most of the time and still be such a badass when it mattered, perhaps the overly dramatic bird for brains could be tougher than he just sounded. Saki refused to judge the gathering crowd on looks alone. They had to have amazing powers to be in one of the hero classes of Japan's top hero school. That, or they had balls of steel. Lily-chan. The cry hardly finished, before Momoyarazu glomped the littlest zombie in a ferocious hug, the sight more than a little creepy in Saki's opinion. I'm sorry for not being there to protect you. Saki would judge the actions of these heroes in training though. Truly badass friends would be subtle with their worry, congratulating her boss for his battle prowess first before obliquely mentioning after any health problems. At least Bird for Brains had been somewhat salvageable, unlike the majority of the brats who'd settled for just swarming her boss with dumbass looks of concern or pity. Would you all just stop? Tsu's abrupt request carried the sharp tone of command. You're crowding my boyfriend and he's not here for your entertainment, Karo. Saki allowed the savage grin that crept across her face, acknowledging the frog girl as a perfect example of what a badass girlfriend was supposed to be like. Tsu worried about Izuku. It was plain to see on her normally expressionless face, but she was able to handle the boss's badassery like no other. The amphibious teen could be direct with him, or blunt with others, all without lessening either's badassness in the slightest. And best of all, she clearly didn't fear the boss. How does someone even walk away from something like that? Saki saw a floating uniform ask a pink-skinned girl. Said girl only shrugged in response, crazy black and gold eyes flicking from the boss to the shrimp and back again. This isn't right. A boring-looking tailed blonde said to himself. And that new girl. He made another one. Saki felt an eye twitch. I'm forfeiting if I have to go anywhere near Midoriya in a battle trial, whispered a sharp-faced idiot with funky-looking elbows to a buffoon with spiky blonde hair and a dim expression. Saki felt her teeth grind against each other. The fear. Now that, Saki took issue with. Fear was the one thing the blonde delinquent hated above all else, the trademark of the weak not worth dealing with. Even now, the aggressive zombie girl could almost feel the way a number of the brats surrounding them feared her boss. Objectively, Saki knew fear was a natural emotion, an instinctual response to that which was dangerous. It could break the will of the weak just as easily as it could sharpen the minds of the strong, and that was a fact she knew all too well. Since the day she discovered she'd been destined to be saddled with a lame-ass quirk that gave her absolutely no advantages whatsoever in combat, she'd known the ins and outs of fear. Her old man had made sure of that. Riji Nikaido had been many things, but he made damn sure he educated his daughter on how to be a warrior. By the time she was 8, she'd been trained to the point no one could call her a weakling or defenseless, and lived to tell about it. Hell, the blonde was pretty sure at this point that she was far more dangerous than half of the so-called heroes in training in the room. These classmates. They reeked of fear. They were afraid of her and her boss. Amazing powers and all the best training, and they were still. Saki. Izuku's stern voice, low as it was, reached the tense blonde without issue. No violence, outside of training. Instantly, Saki felt her muscles unclench, her nerves soothe over, and her growing rage at the idiocy of those around her fall behind a cage of flowing crimson. Her boss had known. He'd known their feelings, and hers. Of course he had, that's why he was such a badass, such a worthy boss. Everyone, the rough word was spoken plainly, but Saki caught how every brat in the room froze up at its utterance. Sit down. The order came from a gruff-looking man dressed in black with a dark white scarf wrapped around his neck. Apparently he was the teacher, as every student in the room, besides the boss and Tsu, leapt to obey his words. One look was all it took, and Saki knew without question that the unkempt teacher of 1A had killed before. No matter how deadened he made his gaze, the blonde could tell just by looking at his coal-black eyes. Midoriya, the man rumbled, finally the boss snapping to attention, why do you keep bringing girls to the classroom? As the boss stuttered out the explanation for her presence, Saki was sure of one thing, she sure as hell wasn't fucking with this guy. Later, UA cafeteria. One Izuku Midoriya, now sandwiched between his ever-protective Shadow-Te and his ever-loving girlfriend Tsuyasui, took a moment of peace in the chaos of the lunchtime rush and studied his life and struggles so far. He examined the bullying he'd suffered, the stigma he lived under, the struggles, dismissals, and agonies both physical and mental. Then, he held those events against the victories he'd had recently. Strangely enough, the green-haired teen felt happy, content even. It all made just a little bit more sense now, thinking back. He'd never been a true regenerator. No one, including himself, ever wanted to be sick or injured. So, his quirk had prevented or repaired damage of any kind his body accrued. Healing capability? He'd never been one to stand by while others were hurt if he could help them. His quirk had reacted accordingly and washed away whatever stood in its path to his happiness. Control, the most hated of his blood side effects? For most of his life he'd been ignored, marginalized by a society stacked against him. He'd been abandoned by everyone save his mother for the longest time. Who wouldn't have wanted to be heard? His quirk had answered his loneliness with full force. Since the day he'd met her, he'd found Tsuchan attractive. She'd been the friendliest girl, besides his mother, he'd ever met at the time. Pushing their relationship forward always flooded him with endorphins, and his quirk must see that as positive reinforcement. Aizawa-sensei had initially displayed impartiality when dealing with him, a first for school staff. And a few times the man had even shown that he was willing to listen to him, really listen. His quirk had taken the initiative and softened the hardened underground pro-hero even further, making the man far more agreeable and willing to help. And in regards to Tai, Lily, and Saki, well, he was still working on why they were the way they were. But they looked happy with their current lives. The successful recovery of Inkomadraya was the backbone for much of Izuku's musings. His mother had healed so quickly the doctors had begged to study him and his quirk until the freshly recovered woman had put her foot down and kicked them all out of her room. And then she'd turned right around and given her son a piece of her mind. That's right. Heart fully mended and eyes gleaming vermilion, Inko had sat up in her bed and scolded Izuku until she'd run out of words to throw at him. She'd grounded him too, for the remainder of the weekend. And then, after all of that, she'd started up on an impressive lecture on the importance of not placing his life in danger. Izuku had cried for much of the time, but his own heart had been as light as a feather. Cursed blood was a sinister quirk, there was no doubt about that, but it was also obedient to a fault. The idea that he could faithfully use his quirk to save people, save lives, without strings attached and be a real hero was finally beginning to settle into Izuku's mind. He might be screened and observed for the rest of his life due to his abilities and how dangerous they made him, but for once those possibilities felt minute in the face of the positive emotions welling up inside of him. Izuku knew he was nowhere near completely over the effects his childhood and society had wrought upon him, but for once the green-haired teen honestly felt hopeful. "Are you alright, Izuku-kun?" Karo asked softly to her boyfriend, who'd been staring into space for the past few minutes. The amphibious teen squeezed one of the Verdanav's hands. She was worried, and for good reason. Her mother's daughter, Su always made sure to keep abreast of what went on around her and the world at large. And recently, it seemed all anyone could talk about was the young man sitting beside her. In concerning numbers, it seemed the press at large was leaning towards vilifying her boyfriend. The news outlets by and large callously strove to use the unfortunate events of his life to gain more popularity and sales for themselves. It irked the frog girl to no end that the media would bring overwhelming attention to the darker side of Izuku's quirk while completely glossing over its positives. Zombies? The anchors and reporters couldn't shut up about them. Saving 2 people from certain death in 2 separate events while also preventing crippling injuries? Not a single second of airtime. Yeah, Izuku replied, dragging himself out of his introspection. He returned his girlfriend's gentle squeezing lovingly. I think I had at that moment, Saki, who'd been agreeable enough to retrieve her boss another round of Gotsudon from the famous lunch rush, snarled so loudly her voice easily eclipsed half of the noise of the cafeteria. "What were you fucking going, Casper?" The blonde's tone conveyed more irritation than true anger. "And maybe stop dragging Mushroom Head there like a goddamn piece of luggage. I swear to fucking God if you'd made me drop the bosses, cease your vulgar reprimands, you cretin." If the blonde delinquent's shouting hadn't caught the attention of most of the cafeteria, then the singular voice that spoke out against her did the job. Suddenly, the bustling food court had largely quieted, stray murmurings catching up those unaware of what was going on. Izuku, already having jumped out of his seat at the first sign of Saki's agitation, paused behind the blonde, taking in the situation. The green-haired teen's latest partner stood tall, imperiously glaring down at a silhouette in the brunette whose hand she still held. Behind the two quaking girls stood a third, whose most noticeable feature was her piercing gaze and writhing, forest green hair of thorny vines. The air quickly became tense as Crimson met Dark Pine and neither budged an inch. Then, to make matters worse, the three who'd managed to earn Saki's ire noticed Izuku's approach, which set off the braver of the trio. "You!" the vine-haired student accused, pointing a finger at the Verdane as if he were the worst criminal imaginable. "Izuku Midoriya." "Huh? Me?" the boy in question asked, clearly unaware of why he was being singled out. Used to having his name spoken in derisive tones much harsher than the girl in front of him could probably ever manage, Izuku was still confused as to what he'd done to warrant such treatment from a complete stranger. A tingling set off under the Verdane's skin, his stomach already said to tie itself into knots. He'd been having such a good moment too. "Yes, you!" the plant-based girl shouted back. "This delinquent's behavior pales in comparison to your sins, devil. I've seen and read all about how you have profaned the dead with your foul quirk. Release their souls now. Give them peace." Stunned silence. None of the observers in the cafeteria could believe what they'd just heard. None even knew how to react to such a declaration. Student and staff alike were all too shocked to act. That is, all but a certain blonde delinquent. "Huh?" Saki's outburst shifted the collective attention away from her frozen boss and onto her, especially that of the plant cunt. "Do you want to die, bitch?" The vine-haired girl took a step back, apprehension flittering across her once self-righteous visage. That tone? The body language the blonde possessed? That look in near glowing crimson eyes? She really meant it. The girl had no idea who this delinquent was, but she was sure down to her bones that she'd never been on the receiving end of such open malice and desire for violence before. It honestly terrified her. Wait. Crimson eyes? From where he continued to stand behind Saki, Izuku allowed the shock and hurt of such a denouncement roll over him and dissipate. For once in his life, the green-haired teen felt no pricks of guilt or lingering doubt cloud his mind in the face of ignorant opposition. The words just spoken were wrong, he knew and accepted that, and this time he wasn't going to stand for them. After all, the vine-haired girl had just basically told him to kill his partners, demanded he force them to experience death a second time before they were ready to move on. And that kind of pissed him off. What? Saki exploded again, seeming to tower over the girl who'd thought to challenge her, call for her second death, and then acted so cowardly. Do I need to rip out your tongue to hear your horseshit again? The ones, still on the floor, Casper and Mushroom Head, chose that moment to scramble to their feet and retreat behind the vine-haired bitch. The duo turned once safely behind their friend, but the burning glare Saki directed at the two caused them to freeze up once again. The girls in question couldn't even quiver, their fear was so gripping. Looking at the blonde was like staring at Medusa. Saki, Izuku calling her name caused the delinquent to snap out of her glowering, backing off to shift and place herself at the green-haired teen's left side. Realizing she probably wouldn't get to crack any skulls, the blonde crossed her arms and gave a savage grin for effect instead. The three strangers who'd begun this whole mess took a collective breath. the two behind the vine-haired girl sagging in relief. They immediately regretted doing so as the Verdanatude stepped between them and the violent blonde fixed them with a hard stare of his own. "The girls I've raised may be undead," Izuku said, surprising those in 1A who'd been watching, with his articulation in such a situation, "but they deserve a chance to live their lives just like anyone else. So please, do not tell me you think they should die again." While he spoke the words softly and rather kindly, the glares of half of Izuku's classmates were very much not so. Momoyarazu in particular looked as if the vine-haired girl had tried to murder her own family. The mature teen tightened her grip on Lily as the widened eyes of the three strangers glanced their way. Well, came a sing-song voice. Blinking, Izuku looked behind the trio before him and saw a blonde from one of the lunch table 1B normally sat at stand up. Seeing he'd gained the attention of his audience, the newcomer's face grew smug. Isn't it quite the surprise that as Monster, for all his fame, is so soft-spoken? The previously uninvolved douchebag raised his arms wide, as if showcasing his discovery to the crowd that was still watching. The teen's cunning gaze and twitching lips were clear tells the blonde held no respect for the green-haired necromancer, and his words weren't meant as a compliment. Just the same, he sauntered closer to his target. "I'll say, your brute of a slave there really scared Shiozaki-san, and poor Yanagi-san and Komori-san too," the conniving teen said, chuckling slightly. Izuku narrowed his eyes as the boy stopped only feet away from him, smirk still present as if he hadn't just purposefully crossed the line. "And what kind of classmate would I be if I let you a monster walk all over 1B's members?" Izuku quirked a brow, not for a minute buying the blonde's bullshit, and he wasn't the only one. Even not directed at him, the green-haired teen could feel the glares from his friends in 1A intensify, especially those he could almost tell came from Tsu-chan and his partners. "One that seems to enjoy escalating a situation," Izuku deadpanned, pointing out the obvious, and insulting others with uncalled-for nicknames. The blonde moved his hands in a half-hearted placating gesture, pulling a sweet smile that curdled for anyone watching with even half a brain. No one believed the 1B student held any good intentions whatsoever. "We didn't come up with the moniker," the smirking teen replied, acting as if he were completely innocent. "All we in 1B did was do a little research after our peers in 1A went through their little incident at the USJ. After the teachers incessantly sang their praises and acted like nothing we did would ever match up, after it seemed like you all were suddenly so outside of our reach we couldn't stand it anymore." The innocuous smile on the blonde's face curved and became pure wickedness. "And do you know what we found?" Izuku felt a bit of unease creep into his spine at the creepy look the 1B member was giving him. It was an unholy cross between superiority and gotcha. The green-haired teen was glad Saki was still by his side. Even though he'd never set the aggressive zombie girl on a fellow UA student outside of training, it was nice to have backup that wasn't stuck at their table. It turned out that 1A was harboring a real nightmare. The blonde exclaimed, eyes wide as he passionately gestured to the bewildered Verdanette across from him. "We all watched as you were shot in the head and then stood up like it was nothing. A little digging and what do you know, one Izuku Midoriya has quite the checkered past. And it all starts with his villainous quirk that he's tried to keep under wraps so he could walk among us like he belongs here." The blonde was breathing heavily now, his sermon complete. Now no one would look at 1A the same again. Heroes? Those scum had a villain in the making in their ranks, and they acted like it was nothing. They didn't deserve to be the face of UA, they didn't deserve to be special. Taking the venomous words in, Izuku looked away from the accusatory blonde, beginning to mumble up a storm. This had been an unforeseen consequence of the rogue newscast, but in hindsight, it had probably been inevitable. And strangely, the green-haired teen found he could live with this. The ignorance of the public, classmates, and even other heroes in training now felt like a lot less heavy of a weight to him. However, if it began to affect his partners, friends, or worse, Tsu-chan, then the Verdanet knew the guilt he'd feel would be too much to handle. So the question was, how did he proceed in a way that focused the outcome of this confrontation on only himself and left the others untouched? Immersed in his own thoughts, Izuku completely missed the fact that the ruthless blonde who doubted him to the entirety of UA student body had slowly positioned himself closer while he'd spoken. Still in his own little word, the Verdanet also missed how the blonde raised a hand sharply above his head, the slap already in motion as it zeroed in on the back of his head. Chomp. All plans of copying the monster's quirk and putting his abominations to sleep for good in a bid to increase his class's popularity fled the blonde's mind as he felt jaws of steel clamp onto his hand and clench. The pained, girly shriek snapped Izuku from his whirlwind thoughts. Blinking rapidly back to reality, the green-haired teen nearly gasped. Tay had one of the blonde's hands in her mouth. And somehow her normally deadened eyes were giving the teen a look that promised murder bloody enough to make Saki proud. Shiozaki and the other two girls from 1B screamed in horror. Those close enough to witness what had happened, and weren't from 1A, froze in terror. For those in the know, such as Kyauka and Fumikage, they were slightly amused. The jerk from 1B had been about to do something to Izuku, and face the consequences. And honestly, they and many of 1A felt the blonde deserved it after everything he'd said. Enough. The roar came from a new girl, a redhead with blazing eyes, who for some reason reminded those of 1A of their class president. In one smooth motion, the newcomer had whipped out a hand and chopped the still screaming blonde in the back of the neck. As soon as the body connected to the hand and her mouth went limp, Tay released her prisoner. The blonde collapsed to the floor in a boneless heap, eyes rolled into the back of his head. "Please, forgive Monoma," the redhead apologized on behalf of the knocked-out blonde with a gentle bow. "He just can't seem to help himself when he thinks he can get attention." Beside her boss, Saki snorted at the attempt at peacekeeping. Attention had been the least of the blonde dumbass's goals, she could just tell. Before the undead delinquent could call out, however, the redhead had turned and affixed the three girls from 1B with a stern look of reprehension. "And you three," the peacekeeper said, tone disappointed, "apologize to Midoriya already. You especially Ibara. I can't believe you'd say those things." The Sylvette, who Izuku guessed was either Yanagi or Komori, bowed to him without a word. The brunette did the same, and even through long, thick bangs, the green-haired teen could tell the shorter of the two was staring hard at him. Unfortunately, he had little hope of discovering why before both had scampered back to the 1B table they must have come from, before bumping into Saki. That left Ibara Shiozaki. And the vine-haired girl did not look happy. "But Itsu, Kendo-san," Shiozaki pleaded, "he's..." Whatever defense the plant-based teen had was cut off as the redhead, Kendo, overrode her voice. "Made it into UA just like everyone else here. He deserves some respect, for that alone if nothing else. Now, apologize." The hard words cowed the spirit of the vine-haired girl, who turned to Izuku and gave a stiff bow. Huffing, Shiozaki stalked back to sit with the other two 1B girls. Speechless, Izuku couldn't help but blush. He'd never had someone outside of his friends and Tsuchan demand others show him respect before. It was a new experience for the green-haired teen. One that his expressionless girlfriend was keen to observe, not that he knew that. You didn't need to have them do that," Izuku said, his long-suppressed shyness coming to the fore at the worst possible time. Desperate to think of some way to change topics, the Verdanet happened to glance at the unconscious blonde at their feet. "Hopefully, Monoma-san will understand that Tae-chan didn't mean him any harm. She's just really protective of me." The peacekeeper from 1B nodded, glad that she seemed to have come in time to keep her class's most combative member from starting a feud. If his target was willing to talk, then surely the situation could still be completely diffused. "I'm sure he will. We all saw what she did in the courtroom," Kendo replied, unsure if her words would be taken well if she continued to speak. "I reckon she could have torn him too," pieces. Long before anyone could have stopped her. Right? Izuku grimaced. That kind of thinking was not the image he wanted his partners to be branded with. And Tae-chan, as his longest-running and most reliable risen, definitely deserved better. You did a great job of training her? Kendo's latest olive branch might as well have been a lit match to the young necromancer. Tense shoulders. Grit teeth. A feeling of heat rising from his stomach to pool in his chest. Izuku had to forcibly hold himself back from the overzealous reaction his body ached to give. He swallowed thickly. It wasn't her fault. They're not trained dogs, you know. Surprisingly, or not, it was the commanding voice of one Kyayu Kajiro that rose up from the silence to correct the insulting misconception. The loud clarification of the now standing rocker girl earned the full attention of the students of 1B in the rest cafeteria. What? Kendo stuttered, looking aghast as her gaze jumped from Kyauka to Izuku. The paling of the redhead's already light complexion gave away the fear that had managed to edge into Peacekeeper's heart. But the reports I read only mention one. Kendo-san. And Shiozaki was back, giving Izuku the stink eye as she gently tugged on the redhead's sleeve. He has sullied more than one corpse with his quirk. The child from the trial footage, the one sitting over there, is one of his zombies as well, and so is she. Shiozaki's flat but informative words came along with an accusatory finger pointing right at the delinquent who'd threatened her earlier. The vine-haired girl knew her guess was correct when the blonde glared daggers at her in response. My friend's quirk may have bridled the darkness to give his partner's life once more, Fumikage Tokoyami suddenly said, but they are all warriors of justice. Kendo, shocked by what she just learned, couldn't decide who to look at. Her eyes bounced from the now statuesque form of Tae, to the cutely pouting face of the child she'd seen from the trial footage, to the snarling delinquent who'd insulted and nearly attacked her classmates. It was a lot to take in. It was. Without another word Atsuka Kendo seemed to blank out. The redhead turned, grabbed Monomo by the scruff of his uniform, and walked away. Suddenly left alone with forces that frankly terrified her, Ibara Shiozaki beat a hasty retreat back to her table once more as well. Taking in the calculating, inquisitive, and judgmental gazes of the rest of UA student body, Izuku could only sigh again. Feeling a sturdy pat on the back from Saki, the green-haired teen could only shake his head. He hoped he wouldn't get into any trouble over this. Hours later, Nezu's office, lobby. I am many things, sir, but I'm no snitch. The hardline assertion from Monoma, the blonde that had given Izuku so much trouble at lunch, only annoyed the green-haired teen more as he heard it a second time. When the announcement had come over 1A's intercom, that his presence was requested in the principal's office, many of his classmates had been outraged. 1B's instigation of the confrontation was shouted out multiple times, though not quite drowning out the few snide comments that this was the logical and fair course of action. In the end their opinions, while overall supportive, didn't matter. Izuku had to go. Perhaps the green-haired teen was lucky to get out of the classroom for a little while? The proposition Ida had made right before he left, that he step down as vice president, had nearly started a civil war. Flashback time, 1A classroom. Midoriya-san, it is my honest and unbiased opinion that temporarily stepping down from your position would be the best thing for you, the bespectacled and stern speedster had stated in his usual loud fashion. At least until you've sorted out what you wish to do with the media. I fear that left unchecked your current problems may negatively impact your performance in carrying out your responsibilities. Or worse, hurt your academic record. Thinking nothing of his classmates' words other than their surface value, Izuku had waved off the concern. Thank you Ida-san, but don't worry about me, the green-haired teen had said, but my quirk, and who would replace him during his sabbatical? Momo had uncharacteristically interrupted, seeming to cut to the most important point, before Izuku had even thought of it. You, Ida-san? The serious speedster had acted as if the mature young woman had slapped him in the face. Ida had then rubbed the back of his neck, unable to look at either of his classmates. "Well, you would be the one to choose, without question," the bespectacled teen had admitted after a moment, "but I would of course volunteer." Izuku had left the decision in the hands of 1A's president, more than happy to abide by her authority. Unexpectedly, at least for him, Momo had almost instantly shot Ida down. Apparently his OCD tendencies were a bigger help to their mature classmate than he thought, as they were one of the many examples of his abilities she'd brought up when she'd informed the speedster that he wouldn't be able to come close to matching his skills as an assistant. Who'd have thought? Flashback end. Present, Nezu's office, lobby. "We should just break his legs," Saki proposed, bringing Izuku back to his current job of keeping his partners from permanently maiming the infuriating blonde. "Or kill him. Take and eat his body to hide the evidence." The dark humor caused Izuku to facepalm. Beside the green-haired teen, Monoma began to quiver in fear. "Nah." Tay's answering groan earned a chuckle from the blonde delinquent, while Lily giggled so hard she almost fell out of her seat. "Lily agrees," the brunette said through her laughter. "Eating trash would be bad for your tummy, Tay." That affront was just enough to break through Monoma's growing distress. "Trash?" the blonde shouted, outraged. One sharp look, from 3 pairs of crimson eyes, had the 1B student clamming up tight, though, too scared to further defend himself. Finally, the door to the principal's actual office opened, causing all present to stand and snap to attention. Nezu appeared, the quirked animal looking none too pleased. Behind him, 2 well-dressed and suited individuals followed. Izuku gulped. "QRA agents. Midoriya-san, thank you for coming so quickly," Nezu greeted one of his favorite students before turning to the blonde present. "Monoma-san, I apologize for this, but these individuals are here to have a word with Midoriya-san. Unfortunately, we'll have to tackle your issue late." The principal was cut off before he could even finish his business, as one of the agents decided that their time was too valuable to waste on manners. "That won't be necessary," the woman of the pair, a redhead, snapped. Izuku bristled as the agent with the name tag labeled R. Masashi acted like she owned the school. The woman's partner stepped forward, self-importance clear to see. "We're only here to collect the reanimated corpse of one Saki Nikaido," the man, who sported odd periwinkle hair, added as if he'd merely requested a signature. The name tag hanging from his breast pocket read R. Kojiro. "You may get back to your business after you've handed it over." Izuku was speechless, completely caught off guard. He'd thought this had been taken care of. Detective Tsukaki had assured him the paperwork had been filed. In spite of his confusion, the green-haired teen never lost the tight frown that spoke of thinly veiled rebellion. Picking up how his student was restraining himself, Nezu couldn't help but lightly smile. "You have no right," Izuku said, nearly shouting. Without thinking, the green-haired teen threw back a hand, silencing Saki before she could say anything to make the situation worse. He'd apologize later. "I have a license for her." Now, Izuku wasn't one to challenge authority normally, but he wasn't going to sit back and just surrender Saki without a fight. She'd sworn to become a hero alongside him, and he wasn't about to let that oath be broken. Even if her exact words had been she agreed to be his henchwoman. "Wait, you have a license?" Monoma asked, reminding Nezu of the blonde's presence. Clearing his tiny throat, the quirked animal gained the attention of the student Vlad King had long since advised him had an axe to grind against his class's sister class. While such a hang-up could be used for the betterment of all involved, now was clearly not the best time to begin leading the blonde in the right direction. "Pity. Monoma-san," Nezu said, "you're dismissed." The blonde continued to sit there, unsure if he was really getting off so easily. Nezu sighed, pinching the bridge of his snout. "Monoma-san," the quirked animal said again, "go back to class. Now." The blonde scampered away, the sight of it vexed Nezu enough to send him running. Sighing again, the quirked animal turned back to his latest, and most aggravating, annoyance. There was a misunderstanding with the permits issued, Masashi said, brushing off Izuku's words and growing temper. The license was allotted for one Rigi Nikaido, not a third-rate delinquent who caused nothing but trouble when she was alive the first time. The office of as principal suddenly became frigidly cold, almost glacial. Now you're asking for it, bitch, Saki hissed, the zombie girl's absolute hatred burning through Izuku's silent command. I'm going to kill you so hard you're going to be reborn dead. The blonde wasn't the only one angered by the agent's callous remark. Tay was openly growling at the two, and the normally cheerful Lily was scowling at the pair. You can't have her, Izuku ground out, stepping between Saki and the QRA representatives. The green-haired teen's adorable face and smooth voice had hardened into something fierce. She is a sentient being with her own free will. She's not going anywhere unless she wants to. The hero in training thought back to Sunday night, when he'd faced a challenge he'd long since believed insurmountable, and had been rewarded handsomely for doing so. Remembering the thoughts and feelings that had filled him when he'd healed his mother, Izuku had given all three of his partners a top-off of blood. After the influx had settled, he'd asked for the trio's unfiltered opinion on remaining his partners. All three had answered with enthusiastically positive responses. Lily and Saki had been incredibly vocal about staying by his side. The littlest zombie had been adamant about fulfilling her revived desire to become an idol and hero the world would love and look up to. Saki's assurance had been more aggressive and rebellious, the blonde insisting that, although she'd follow him, she wanted no part in continuing her old man's heroic legacy. Tay had merely looked at him as if she couldn't understand what he was asking and rolled her head forward onto his chest. He hadn't cried at that. He hadn't. And now some two-bit bureaucrats wanted to cut the wings off of one of his partners? Not on his watch. Off to the side, Nezu stood equal parts confused, and full of pride. The quirked animal had been certain that after facing the relentlessness of the media, his dear student would be in dire need of counseling and support. Instead, Izuku Midoriya looked to be stronger, more sure of himself than he'd ever appeared to be before. It was as if the boy had overcome a number of his inner demons, and in such a short amount of time. Of course we can. And yes it is, the periwinkle man countered with an all too smug voice. And since you barely seem to be able to control these things at the best of times, we might as well go ahead and take them all of your hands while we're at it. The glacial temperature of the room abruptly skyrocketed, Izuku containing his rage by the skin of his grit teeth. This had long since been a matter of retaining his potential to become a hero. This was about protecting his friends, partners, and family. The green-haired teen found himself taking a step forward, which caused a chain reaction of panic to shoot through his mind. For all he wanted to, and they deserved it, he couldn't actually attack agents of the QRA. Luckily, he wouldn't have to. Actually, no you can't, and no she won't, came an unexpected voice. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku blinked in shock as a woman seemed to appear out of seemingly thin air. The tall newcomer was impeccably dressed in a black suit and slacks, and spoke with an accent so refined it was impossible to determine her origins. She held up a steaming mug, the fragrant aroma spelling cocoa in the air. Oh my, Nezu dear, you just have to tell me who I have to kill, to get this coffee brew of yours. The intruder instantly gained the attention of all involved, each person living and not, wondering how and when the woman had entered the office. They all took her in. The only identifying feature the newcomer wore was a name tag, reading only a single word, Smith. Her long raven locks appeared glossy and extremely well cared for, and almost blended in with her suit. The sunglasses she wore seemed off somehow, designed to conceal as much as possible but still appear sleek. They reflected no light whatsoever, as if cut from shards of Vanta Black or Black 2.0. Obviously not me, Smith-san, Nezu replied in a rarely seen jovial manner, although Izuku could tell the hyper-genius was somewhat wary of the woman. I'll be getting another bag in a few weeks, so feel free to take as much as your heart desires today. The woman, Smith, laughed heartily at the principal's words. She sipped from her mug with a flirty grin. "I'll take your word for it." The gleeful reply did nothing to ease the growing feeling of dread that had slowly begun to fill the room. Far more hesitantly than she'd ever done before, Saki tugged on Izuku's shirt sleeve to gain his attention. Refusing to take his eyes off the newcomer who radiated an aura he'd never felt before, the green-haired teen subtly nodded for the blonde to speak. "Boss," the normally rebellious zombie said, voice lowered as much as possible, I think she's a spook." "I guessed as much," Izuku replied, surprising the adults present, except for Smith herself, though whether it was from his deduction or the occupation of the intruder, the green-haired teen couldn't tell. Smith, interestingly enough, merely quirked a brow at the young hero in training. "Oh?" the intimidating woman asked, eyeing the green-haired teen who'd figured her out with a discerning gaze. "You could tell?" Izuku nodded, holding up a closed fist. "Special anti-ballistic, weave uniform with interwoven energy-resistant plating," the Verdanet stated, raising one finger as he referenced the woman's suit. He raised the second finger. "Anti-reflective shades with integrated camera and microphone." Smith began to grin at the intelligence and observation skills of the youngling in front of her. "Taichan didn't notice you entering," Izuku continued, raising another finger, as his first partner slowly nodded and gave a grunt of affirmation. The fourth finger rose. "And then there's the name. That's a code. The language might change, but all the other agents shared the same name tag too." Smith chuckled, amused beyond all expectation with the Verdanet. He was a special one. Izuku had let himself believe he was a lot of things over the years, but he'd never been a fool. Unlike most of the officers he'd encountered during his brief internship, who looked away when agents of Interpol had gotten involved with their work, he'd made sure to pay attention. Every detail of the members of the international organization had been committed to memory, even the schematics of their uniform, which he'd copied down to add to the next version of his hero costume. Detective Tsukaki had caught him looking at Agent Sato once, and had taken it upon himself to explain a few more things to him. According to him, back when the number of people with quirks had officially overtaken the quirkless worldwide, the major countries had agreed to officially dissolve their foreign intelligence agencies as a whole. The CIA, the reborn KGB, ASIS, MI6, China's still unnamed bureau. The list went on. Every one of them had been disbanded in the face of growing presence of superpowers. In response, Interpol had stepped in and absorbed as many capable agents as they could assure the loyalty of. The result had been temporarily chaotic, until the first director had put their foot down and combined like aspects of every operative's past agency to facilitate the transition. One such policy had been that protecting the true identity of agency was tantamount to sacred work, hence the universally accepted idea that all agents be named Smith or its equivalent in other languages. It increased the difficulty of an agent being found out. Many were assigned a Smith alias in a language not their own. "Namasa was right about you, kid," Agent Smith said, taking a sip of her coffee. "I like you already." The encouraging words struck hard and deep. Izuku felt an odd sense of elation. Detective Tsukaki had been impressed with him, and praised him as well, but this agent was on an international level and still said as much. It almost made the green-haired teen lightheaded to even think about. The fact that it was a spook who'd praised him, a figure of shadow and walking nightmare that were as a group infamous for being killing machines and taking down their targets regardless of quirk, completely went over the hero in training's head. And what is Interpol doing sticking its nose in Japan's business? The woman, Masashi asked, her trepidation warring with her belief she was untouchable. It would be a disaster if the international agency decided they wanted to collect the undead for themselves. The tall Ravnet side-eyed the QRA agents through her shades, causing the duo to visibly shiver as a feeling of killing intent washed down their spines. "To business then," Smith said instead of answering, reluctantly placing her mug of coffee on a side table. "You too. Feel free to go back to your cubicles and inform your boss that one Izuku Midoriya is now under the UN's jurisdiction as a probationary asset. This, of course, includes any and all uses of his quirk, ergo every undead he raises in the name of justice. Izuku blinked. He blinked again. A third blink did little to abate his confused disbelief. Had Smith just stated that he technically outranked the QRA at illegal level? "We're not your golfers," Kojiro snarled. The periwinkle man was, obviously, against being ordered around. Smith shrugged in response, the antagonistic response sliding off of her without concern. Digging into her pocket, the spook pulled out her smartphone, the device already ringing. "Hello, Mr. G," Smith greeted, loud enough to be heard by the entire room. The QRA agents paled, distress evident on their faces. "It's Agent Smith." The spook gave a lopsided grin at whatever response she received over the phone. Unfortunately, the call was not on speaker. "Why I'm calling?" "Well." As Smith trailed off, it looked as if Masashi and Kojiro were on the brink of begging. For what, Izuku didn't know. "Thankfully. Your kids were rude to me. What can I say?" The QRA agents slumped, realizing their fate had been sealed. Izuku took the scene in, amazed at how easily the international agent had taken the two rude operatives to task. It was honestly scary. "No, not those two. The ones you sent to collect the zombie girls," Smith corrected, the statement seeming odd to the green-haired teen. "Which, come to think of it, is strange because I'm pretty sure you have the memo ordering you to leave the boy alone on your desk." "Where?" "It should be right in front of you, under that silly mug of yours that says boss." The way Smith said it, so nonchalantly, as if knowing the ins and outs of someone's office were second nature to her, blew Izuku's mind. The green-haired teen could predict that whoever the spook was talking to was, well, spooked out of his skin. "Ah, so it was just an honest mistake then, yes?" Smith clarified, sweet voice curling into a venomous facsimile as she continued, "Then everything's alright. Just make sure you give your kids a proper scolding, and we won't have to have this conversation again." By now, exactly 10 seconds after Smith had hung up, Masashi and Kojiro's phones rang at the same time. Without saying a word, the two QRA agents retreated. Izuku didn't need a clairvoyance quirk to know that by the expressions on the duo's faces they'd be cleaning toilets for months to come. "Well, looks like most of my business is done here," Smith announced as she snatched up her coffee mug again. "But the rest can wait a bit. I think our cute little plushie has something important to say." Izuku unconsciously twitched at the description of his school's principal. The thought might have been accurate, but it required a rare level of bravery to even think of speaking it aloud. "Right," Nezu simply agreed, the quirked animal barely suppressing a night twitch at the spook's words. "Midoriya-kun, as you may have noticed during your lunch period, our 1B class has appeared to have grown restless." They had hardly come to terms with 1A's great feat of heroism, as Kansans tells me they call the USJ incident, when your unfortunate experience at the courtroom became public. Seeing the bewildered confusion on the face of one of his most intelligent students caused the quirked animal to huff. Sometimes the principal of Japan's greatest hero school forgot how young and naive his newest protege still was, even in the face of hardships of his life. "They feel slighted, Midoriya-kun," Nezu said plainly, crossing his short arms as his own frustrations with the rivalry between the freshman hero course classes came to the surface. And Kan-san repeatedly telling them that they aren't ready to face similar perils has only bloodied their overinflated sense of pride even further. Beginning to connect the dots, Izuku furrowed his brow, his mind replaying the day's events through a more contextual lens. "And as I'm sure you've no doubt guessed by now, we cannot and will not place students in danger purely for the sake of proving a point, or to indulge in patience and petty egotism," Nezu continued, the green-haired teen nodding at the accurate guess. Then, the principal's face, muzzled, whatever twisted, as if sudden indecision had taken hold of the normally stalwart quirked animal. "That being said, Midoriya-kun, I wish to Oh come on Zuzu. Smith teased, a half-smile pulling a dimple from her angular face. Don't get wet for now. The kid can take it. Midoriya was once again slapped in the face with the fact that the spook before him was someone that had the courage to speak to UA principal so familiarly and playfully. But the woman's words also sent a tension through his body. It sounded like he wouldn't enjoy whatever was coming. I have no doubt he can, Smith-san, Nezu agreed, completely ignoring the cutesy nickname that the spook had revealed to his student. The quirked animal turned to fully face the young hero in training before him that had already shouldered so many hardships, hoping he wouldn't be resented for adding one more. Given your brilliance Midoriya-kun, I would like for you to devise a test of sorts for your peers in 1B. They need to be exposed to the dire conditions pro-heroes face in the real world, but in a controlled environment that will not negatively affect them in the long run. Immediately, Izuku could almost feel his mental gears beginning to turn in the back of his mind as he tried to digest the task his principal had laid out for him. A test to put 1B in life-threatening danger without it being truly life-threatening? It almost sounded like he was being asked to be a era, Smith drawled playfully, taking another sip of her coffee. You really did it, Nezu? Asked the poor boy to play the villain for you? Nezu snapped around to glower at the spook with a heavy look of displeasure. While the quirked animal didn't growl, Izuku could see the fine hairs at his principal's neck start to stand on end. Smith-san. Nezu grit out with forced control. I would never. It's alright. Izuku spoke up before the two could begin trading verbal blows. The green-haired teen took a deep, shaky breath. It makes sense. Both adults were struck silent by the sight of the Rathed M before them. Neither had expected the young hero in training to so readily accept the proposal, much less with the wavering smile he'd plastered onto his face. Swallowing thickly, Izuku looked between Nezu and the spook and continued his point. Class 1B needs a wake-up call, or at least, that's what it seems like you are saying, sir, Izuku said, receiving a nod from the quirked animal. Smith raised an inquisitive brow. And historically speaking, it's been proven that it's the mastermind type of villain that can make or break heroes. Based on my experience at the USJ, and given the recent development of that moniker Mono-san was throwing around today and the footage from the trial, I can see why I would be a good choice to put them through this kind of test. Nezu blinked, unsure of what he was looking at for a moment. Had his student miraculously overcome his deeply ingrained trauma in moments? The thought birthed and died in seconds as the quirked animal looked closer, and saw the truth. Minute shivers, just barely perceivable, racked the Rathed M's frame. No, Izuku Midoriya hadn't completely conquered the demons of his past, but he seemed to have taken a great step in battling towards victory. The principal wished the two were alone at that moment, so that he could express how proud he was of the green-haired teen. I think I can do it, Izuku said, hesitant, clearly battling the rising steel of his conviction. The green-haired teen's observers visibly noticed as that steel set into strength in his spine, his back straightening, eyes hardening. My classmates went through hell, and some are still feeling the effects, I know, but they are all by and large better prepared for their future as heroes because of that hardship. Class 1B doesn't understand that yet. But they will. The grin Agent Smith wore at those words was wide and innocently wicked, causing Nezu even more concern than his student's abrupt and unforeseen maturation. What had he just done? Can we get a little rough with the little shits? Saki asked, the rebellious zombie girl wearing a viciously gleeful smile of her own as she punched one of her hands into its partner. That'll depend on the student, Izuku replied, deciding after a moment of thought. It was true as far as he could see. There would be some members of 1B that could take far more punishment than their fellows, before any kind of lesson such as this would sink in. As the Rathed M descended into a muttering spree, surrounded by the eager suggestions of Lillian Saki and the silent support of Tae, Agent Smith snorted at the sight. Turns out she'd had nothing to worry about after all. Izuku Midoriya, after a lifetime of stigma and systematic abuse, after learning the true nature of his quirk, after finally being given the honest thoughts of his undead partners, and after finally realizing that the dark power within him was his to control, had begun to embrace what he truly was. He was no monster. No born-to-be villain. He was no knight in shining armor either. No paladin nor cleric. He was, and always would be, a sinister hero. And by all appearances at the moment, the green-haired teen looked to be able to live with that. It seemed having the ability to save everyone the way he'd always wished to was enough for the Rathed, even if those same people may fear him for how he went about his work. The spook slipped out of the office unnoticed, her old friend fixated on his student and said student dead to the world as he brainstormed. For once, it looked like Smith would be able to submit a mission accomplished without leaving a trail of dead bodies in her wake. Today had been a good day. Later, evening, UA High School courtyard. Tenya stood just outside of the institution he'd always dreamed of learning at, one of the key foundations of his country's future heroes, and felt dissatisfied and frustrated. The speedster hadn't revealed the information to his classmates, but his spur-of-the-moment attempt to alleviate some of Midoriya-san's responsibilities hadn't come as completely out of the blue as he let on. The bespectacled teen had spent many days speaking to his older brother and, more recently, Uraraka-san. Tensai had been the guiding light of experience that had allowed Tenya to realize, as unheroic as it was, that he didn't trust Midoriya-san because of his quirk. The Verdana's abilities were far too dark and had too much potential for villainy for the younger Ida's liking. However, that same epiphany brought with it an enlightenment of sorts. Tenya had come to accept that his perspective was flawed, mired in ignorance and fear, and need to be corrected. The speedster now acknowledged that he needed to learn to live with the fact that all quirks, dark or light, could be used heroically. It came down to the user. It had helped that Uraraka-san had sat with him after he listened to her vent her issues and outright told him that from an outsider's perspective he appeared to be more than a little jealous of 1A's dark cinnamon roll. After all, the brunette had claimed, how could the brother of a renowned hero like Ingenium be expected to feel when not only does he fail to become his class's president, but also its vice president, when a necromancer did? Tenya sighed, head drooping as he thought over the train wreck that had been his proposal. The idea had been to take Midoriya-san's place as vice president for a time, ascertain whether or not they tackled the inherent responsibilities any differently or with varying levels of success, and finally have a solid foundation with which to compare the two's mettle. Unfortunately, the bespectacled teen now feared his plan had caused his classmates to view him as a conniving scoundrel. The negative reaction to his suggestion that Midoriya step down, followed by his hesitant offer to take his place temporarily, had been far greater than he'd anticipated. If he'd been even a millisecond slower, he'd have been hit with Sero-san's desk when Jiro-san had jumped to her feet in indignation and caused the hallowed furniture of their seniors to fly backwards. The yelling from the punk rock girl and others hadn't made him feel any better either. One last sigh escaped the younger Ida-san as he finally made his way off of school grounds. The bespectacled teen hoped with a heavy heart that tonight would be one of those rare nights Tensai would be able to get home for a family meal. He really needed more advice. Later, night, Midoriya residence. Inside the normally peaceful and warm domicile, cries of protestation and opposition could be heard. The matriarch of the family had been much more not okay with her baby, her radiant angel, agreeing to play the villain in some test that principal of his had cooked up than said child had expected. Izuku of course had tried to explain the situation, and why he felt he could, and should, participate. But Enko Midoriya had never been an easy woman to convince. Unbeknownst to the occupants of the currently quarreling home, outside the dwelling, a single QRA agent was keeping watch over the area. After the near disaster earlier in the day with the spook, the big boss of the agency had issued a new memo. Orders now were to keep to a watch and report routine. Interpol had apparently been incredibly explicit in describing the breadth of their authority when it came to the Emerald Necromancer, which was none whatsoever. In spite of that, The inherent danger posed by undead, freely walking around hadn't been completely ignored. The QRA had been given leave to at least post some kind of token surveillance. The single agent stationed outside the Midraya household had other ideas, however. Capturing one of the undead girls, one that had just happened to wander off and become unsupervised, would set the nondescript woman for life. Or at minimum, in a key position for a major promotion. And the agent even had the perfect target. Of the necromancer's 3 tools, the one with the least observed intelligence appeared to be functionally dead to the world so long as her owner wasn't in danger. Taking that one down would be child's play. Watching, the woman hid herself as best she could as the Rathed of the undead trio exited the Midraya's home with a number of trash bags in hand. Her opportunity had arrived. Everyone thinks I'm a failure. The QRA agent slunk through the shadows, approaching her quarry without making a sound. The undead shambled towards the apartment complex's communal dumpster without missing a beat. I usually get ignored most of the time, and no one really listens when I try to speak up. Patiently, the agent waited until the mindless undead had opened the lid of the dumpster. When the moment was right, she struck. "Got you," the agent hissed, barely suppressing the urge to shout. Snapping her arm out, the woman jabbed her target with her common-issue taser. "Huh?" Tay leaned her head back, eyeing the woman whom she'd noticed had been creeping up on her with a dead, empty ruby stare. Following the attacker's outstretched arm, the zombie girl saw a weapon of some sort, was poking her. Based on the random sparks that would shoot from the metal prongs that were jabbing her ribs, it was shock-based. "Is this thing working?" the unknown woman shouted, instantly losing her cool facade when she no doubt realized her weapon had no effect. Pulling her arm back, Tay's attacker turned the dial on her taser up to maximum. "Let's try that again." A few seconds pass, and the sparks from the taser continue to shoot out, showing the stun tool was in fact working. To no effect. Tay, almost gently, took the weapon from the clearly confused woman's hands. Wide-eyed, the unfortunate would-be attacker watched as the zombie girl turned the dial back down to medium. Then the undead Rathed jabbed the woman with the taser, zapping her strongly enough to immediately knock her unconscious. After a few moments, and not a few more failed attempts, Tay was able to stuff the woman who'd attacked her into the dumpster. Nearly finished, the zombie girl wrapped up by placing the full bag of trash she'd been tasked with throwing out on top of the woman. "Oi! Tay!" The boorish shout from Saki carried to Tai with little problem. Turning, the Rathed stared emptily back at the glaring blonde. "What's taking you so long, Wonder Girl?" the delinquent snarked, tossing a thumb over her shoulder. "Come on." "Nah," Tay groaned in response, earning a huff from the blonde rebel. "Well, if the trash is putting up that much of a fight, call for help," Saki snapped, mumbling something that sounded an awful lot like weirdo under her breath right after. "Now hurry up, the boss doesn't like you out here wandering around by yourself." Instead of groaning again, Tay simply nodded, throwing the last of her trash bags into the dumpster. Right as Saki pulled her head back into the Midraya's apartment, the head of the QRA agent poked up from the piles of refuse. The woman appeared quite dazed. You. The woman groused, finding it difficult to even speak. "You can't do this to me. I'm, wham. Crack." The lid of the dumpster slammed onto the QRA agent's head, silencing the woman's building tirade before it began. A muffled thump echoed from inside the trash receptacle, followed by a barely discernible moaning. "Idiot." The insult, spoken in a raspy voice hardly used, went unheard by the world. Without a backwards glance, Tay straightened and walked back to the place she called home. As she neared the front door, her limbs returned to their listless ways, causing her to shuffle again. A muffled thump echoed from inside the trash receptacle, followed by a barely discernible moaning. "Idiot." The insult, spoken in a raspy voice hardly used, went unheard by the world. Without a backwards glance, Tay straightened and walked back to the place she called home. As she neared the front door, her limbs returned to their listless ways, causing her to shuffle the last few feet. It's okay though, I guess. I suppose I really don't care if the world ignores me anymore. After all, I already have the attention of the most important person in my life. Magnus. Hopefully nobody will think that Izuku is embracing the dark side. Even so, that doesn't mean that Class 1B will have an easy time dealing with their upcoming challenge. Chapter 22 A Sinister Realization. Magnus. So. Class B wanted to face a crisis. I suppose it's only fair to accommodate their wishes, right? Enjoy. The Zero Observant 3, and please remember to keep all hands and feet inside the moving vehicle at all times. Buckle up. Disclaimer. There are references thrown all across this chapter. I hope you enjoy them. With the resumption of classes at UA, Japan's most lauded schools for heroic education, the entirety of that year's Class 1B finally found themselves reunited. Unexpectedly, they found their first, much-anticipated heroics class sinister return occurring at the entrance of Ground Gamma, instead of their classroom. The only hint Vlad King, their grizzled teacher, had given them? Special training. Needless to say, a majority of the class wasn't happy about this development. Special training? Ndo Monoma, the blonde instigator and Class 1A hater, scoffed for the umpteenth time, more like pity treatment. The rather Aryan-looking teen in a tuxedo-like hero costume had been at it since the announcement had been made that morning. Sneering, snarking, and all-around grousing had been the blonde's general attitude since. It was frankly more annoying than anything at this point. However, if one were to look closely, hiding behind squinted sapphire eyes lay genuine hurt at once more having his class relegated to a mere second thought. You're telling me Togaru Kamakiri, one of Class 1B's more unique students, griped in agreement. The tall and slender teen, while actually wielding a transformation quirk, had nonetheless been born with an appearance more in line with that of a mutation type. Bluntly speaking, the boy had the head of a fierce-looking insectoid, made all the more intimidating by how his shaggy green hair was styled into a mohawk. We should be out there getting some real-life experience already. The loudly declared sentiment was met with a smattering of agreement from the rest of the class. Many of Class 1B shared the belief that they deserved a chance to shine just like their sister and rival Class 1A had been given at the USJ. Knock it off already. There were a few rebels, however, who stood against such brazen notions from their classmates. One, Class 1B's president in fact, was completely in opposition of the idea. If Kan-sensei says we're not ready, then we aren't, Itsuka Kendo said, taking a stand at the front of her embittered class. Clad in her thigh-length, turquoise hero costume, reminiscent of a Chinese kapao, the fiery-haired young woman turned and eyed each member of 1B. Taking as deep a breath as the black corset that accentuated her curves would allow, the martial artist continued to admonish the excitable teens before her. We should be focusing on learning, as much as we can, doing as much as we can, right now. That way, when the time comes, we too will be able to challenge and overcome adversity. The scattered nodding and positive murmurings disturbed the class president. There were far too many of her classmates who were still dead set on following Monoma and Kamakiri's path. Their stubbornness honestly irked the redhead. She'd had a chat with her counterpart from 1A as soon as she could after the USJ incident, and the horrors the Ravnet had recounted having to survive. It still brought a shiver to her spine. While I agree with the wisdom of your words, Itsuka-Nizan, a beast of a teen called out as he joined the conversation, can you honestly say that you believe we of 1B do not stand on equal footing with our fellows of 1A? Immediately, Itsuka found her eye twitching at the sight of her furred classmate. Jiroda Shishida, normally as gentlemanly of a scholar as one could ever hope to find, was currently half-naked in his hero costume. The redhead couldn't tell if it was her classmate's get-up of black jeans, sunglasses, and ridiculously singular shirt collar that had caused the involuntary muscle spasm, or the fact that one of her most stalwart backers had just agreed with Monoma. Seeing the look on his class president's face, Jiroda raised his clawed hands in surrender. I am not proposing that we should throw ourselves at real villains, of course, the beastly teen backtracked, a sweat drop somehow managing to remain visible as it made tracks down his face. I merely suggest we should honestly consider the pro et contra of submitting a proper petition for a more advanced training curricula. Realizing that the furred gentleman of 1B hadn't abandoned her camp entirely, Izuku felt an unknown weight somewhat lift from her shoulders. That weight, however, came crashing back down as more and more of their classmates began to openly declare their own desires. The majority unfortunately seemed to land in the pro-adversity camp. It made the redhead's stomach drop. "I ready," shouted Pony-san, not to worry, with a fist bump. The bubbly blonde's broken Japanese betrayed her American heritage, although already she'd made great strides in improving her language skills. Now if only her classmates could stop Monoma from teaching the innocent girl obscenities to hurl at 1A. Izuku still couldn't believe the slightly equine-looking teen could make for such an adorable image, especially with her interesting costume choice of a black buckled harness over a blue and white skirt. Maybe it was her big, sparkling Prussian blue eyes that just melted your heart? We should ask for a joint practice. Tetsu, Class 1B's resident metal manly man, roared before pounding his fists together, crossing his arms. The Sylvet glared at any who dared to look at him weirdly, which was no one, in a useless attempt to appear even manlier in his sleeveless green jumpsuit. At this point, Izuku could feel a headache coming on. Why did her class have to be full of so many stubborn idiots? Raising a hand to make her point once again, the redhead was cut off before she could utter a word. I for one agree with Tetsu-san. Shiozaki, Class 1B's resident Christian, announced in her customary peaceful tone. The vine-haired young woman, who many agreed was cosplaying as a Roman or Grecian goddess with her pure white toga, took a measured step forward. The rowdy members of the class, those that had still been readying their own arguments, quieted. Izuku felt the stirrings of hope that another voice of reason had joined the fray. If it is for the sake of shared knowledge and field experience, Ibar continued, raising Kendo's hopes even further. Finally, at least a sensible suggestion from this mob she called family. And if, by the grace of God, opportunities to lead certain enslaved souls to salvation happened to occur along the way, I would of course do my utmost best, as a devout follower of our Lord, to do so. Izuku buried her face into her hands. Hadn't her classmates only days ago started an uncalled-for confrontation? What made them think they were in any way mature enough for advanced heroics when she couldn't even convince them in the following days to properly apologize to the victimized party? Their entire feud against one particular 1A student was irrational. Near the back of the 1B group, a little away from the others, one Kanoko Komori couldn't help but ignore her classmates as she sighed to herself like a girl who'd just experienced her first heartbreak. I wish I wasn't such a coward," Kanoko murmured to herself, bowed head allowing her long bangs to completely cover her eyes as she peered down at her too short mushroom-themed hero costume. Constantly pulling the wide, stiff hem of the red with white polka-dotted skirt down was becoming tiresome. Maybe then I'd be able to ask the support department for a better costume. The mushroom-themed girl was more than a little upset with whichever company had created the first rendition of her hero costume. Her dress was supposed to look cute, damn it, not sexy. She didn't want to give off the wrong impression to anyone she ran across while in the line of duty after all. It didn't help that her quirk was a bit on the creepy side if you asked her. "Don't worry, Kanoko-chan," Reiko Yanagi, Komori's best friend in 1B, assured through her black face mask, "you can always do so next time." Although the Sylvet spoke in monotone, her mushroom-themed friend knew she truly did care about her troubles, even if she didn't quite understand them. After all, the wielder of the poltergeist quirk had confided in her that she'd intended for her thigh-length white kimono, with its crimson furred collar, to stand out. The outfit was apparently meant to be sexy, but sensible. Kanoko thought some people took the whole quirk theme a bit far if you asked her. The mushroom girl sighed, sneaking a look at the still unraveling situation at the front of 1B. Her costume issue paled in comparison to the guilt she felt for being responsible for triggering the feud that was tearing her class apart in the first place. All she'd wanted to do was say hello to a certain Verdanet, see if he maybe still remembered her. Ask forgiveness for being such a coward for all these years. Enough with the chatter. The roar instantly froze each and every member of 1B in their tracks, regardless of whether or not they had been participating in the feud's latest manifestation. Vlad King, the rough-and-tumble teacher of 1B, had finally arrived. And the grizzled man was not happy to find his class bickering like, well, schoolchildren. The frown that pulled at the pro's lips at the sight of their lax behavior forced his exaggerated underbite even further forward, his two lower canine gleaming. All right, the tusked man grunted when he realized his class was paying him their complete attention. Form up. 2 lines. Follow me. In only moments, Kendo had divided her classmates evenly into formation. Leading the way behind their sensei, the redhead couldn't help but feel that the muscular man who'd been their rocket UA wore a far too serious look upon his face. And that was saying something when one spoke of Sekijiro Kan. As you heard earlier, today's training is special. The blood hero paused, eyeing the timed looks many of his knuckle-headed students pulled at his words. Or perhaps, different would be a better way of putting it. The goal is to provide you with experience closer in nature to what the field of heroics will be like in the real world. The pro-hero picked up on every eye roll and sigh of annoyance at his announcement, even before he turned around. The Sylvet felt his blood begin to boil. Just remember, you all asked for something like this. So, Vlad King trailed off. As the closest one to their sensei, only Kendo witnessed the pro's visage darken, giving the man a look of internal confliction. An knot of worry began to take root in the redhead's stomach. Before she could question her teacher, the man pressed on. Listen. A crucial part of heroics, out there in the real world, is developing the ability to pick up on clues on the fly. If you can't learn to differentiate between what appears to be happening, and what truly is, then you'll only make yourself and those around you easy pickings for the worst sort of villains. The serious and grave tone of the declaration successfully magnetized the attention of the entirety of Class 1B. A number of the students looked back at their sensei, grateful for the wisdom passed on to them. Others appeared to have delved into their own thoughts, turning the words over again and again, looking for meaning. Let's go. The blood hero said, quick to switch gears. Turning back around, the muscular man wasted no time in resuming his march. There's no time to waste. A lot of effort was put into making this training session one you'll never forget. In no time at all, Class 1B had traversed a large part of the test site, arriving at the central main street. Nodding his head as if satisfied, Vlad King turned around once more, this time without missing a beat. Walking backwards, the pro continued to walk with supreme confidence in his every step. You will first be separated into groups, and then dropped into random locations, the Sylvet said without further preamble. All teams have only 2 objectives to fulfill to pass. Find a hostage, and secure a super weapon. Several nods came from across the following students. This was exactly the kind of scenario that 1B had expected, nothing surprising. Or especially taxing. There's a catch of course, Vlad King continued, you'll all be harassed by foe villains. Significant damage inflicted by these opponents will be considered lethal, while conversely you will only be allowed to employ countermeasures to capture or neutralize them. Again, many of 1B were disgruntled with these rather simple parameters. Sure, the inclusion of foe villains in an exercise would be a new twist for them, but it was probably only UA attempt at making 1A's experience at the USJ appear less advantageous for their rivals. This was hardly even a slight upgrade to their previous training sessions. These and other detrimental assumptions caused many of 1B to immediately begin ignoring their sensei's explanation, most only hearing the part about hostages and super weapons before tuning out completely. They'd just ask for the full lecture again once they reached the test's starting point. No problem. Reaching the facsimile of a major intersection, Class 1B arrived at a raised platform in the middle of the road. Resting on the large dais was a large, cylindrical mechanism, two large machine claws capping either end. Wearing a coloration of black with yellow stripes, it was obvious to the heroes in training that this was their super weapon, a bomb of some kind. A biohazard symbol sat prominently on the weapon's front, a nice touch but ultimately boring. Was it too much to ask for a giant mecha dinosaur with rocket launchers or something? Your students don't seem too enthused, Kansan, a husky, rather seductive voice drawled from behind the weapon. The click of heels heralded the arrival of a pro hero every male of 1B instantly recognized, the unmistakably sexy R-rated heroine, Midnight. Hopefully I'll be able to fire them up. Nothing like a vigorous workout, right? Cracking her whip, the sensual heroine licked her lips as she descended the stage. The sight alone seemed to lift the spirit of the gathered students. Well, the males at least. From her place at the front of one of the lines, Kendo quickly went to work analyzing this new development. If Midnight was going to be present, then she was probably going to be playing the part of their faux villain. This training had just gotten a lot more intense than any of their previous sessions in less than a minute. I would be grateful if you did, Vlad King groused, seeming to agree with his salacious co-worker. These runs have been begging for this for weeks now. I would be disappointed if they suddenly decided to back out now. Or not take this seriously. Belatedly realizing this was a jab at them, certain members of 1B failed to react in time before more arrivals to the intersection appeared. Yo-kan-san! Came the cheerful shout of Power Loader, the head of a support department. The short redhead encased in excavation gear walked up to those already gathered, flanked by Hound Dog, UA lifestyle guidance counselor, and a pinkette wearing a seemingly custom-built helmet and goggles that screamed steampunk. We would have been here sooner, but Hatsum here had to run some last-minute calibrations on our super weapon. But, no worries, the city-wide gauntlet has been finished now. Sashaying back up the stage to stand beside the weapon, Midnight waved her whip at the device with a satisfied look on her face. That's great, Majima-san. I was wondering what this was supposed to do, the R-rated heroine said, gathering steam as she spoke. Now, I think a quick rundown will help us excite Class 1B, don't you think? Unable to contain all of their disappointment at correctly guessing the nature of the mechanism on the dais, most of heroic students present rolled their eyes with barely suppressed groans. You'll love it. Chimed in the pinkette Power Loader head called Hatsum. Excitement and pride filled the energetic support student's voice as she literally vibrated in place. We loaded the Mecha Rex with all kinds of babies, guns, laser turrets, heat-seeking missile launchers. The entirety of Class 1B, including their sensei, watched on in confusion as Hatsum pulled her remote from somewhere and pressed a series of buttons too quickly to follow. An ear-splitting metallic screeching ripped through the air as a mechanical monstrosity stepped out from behind one of the towering faux plans that littered Ground Gamma. The metal beast looked every bit as badass as advertised, its exterior bristling with so much weaponry it would have been intimidating even just standing still. It was everything the frustrated younglings of 1B had wanted. So that begged the question. Why add a bomb? Perplexed at the additional firepower, Midnight glanced from the giant Mecha Rex to the towering bomb next to her on the dais. Puzzlement furrowed the heroine's normally enticingly masked visage. Catching on to the source of his co-worker's confusion, Power Loader slapped a hand over his face in exasperation. Hatsum. The excavation hero groaned, annoyance clear in the pro's voice. What have I said about leaving your crazy inventions laying about in the test sites? The reprimand brought sighs of relief and feelings of ease. No need to think too hard on the anomaly if it was just a case of laziness delaying cleanup. But that baby isn't mine. Hatsum whined, quick to defend herself. Those few who'd already been exposed to the girl, teacher and student alike, tensed. There was no way the pinkhead would ever deny ownership of one of her inventions. or truly leave it just lying around outside of her lab unsupervised. Powerloader crossed his arms, the uncharacteristic crossness instantly reminding Class 1B how strict the support department head was when it came to equipment safety, especially when other people were involved. "Then whose is it?" the agitated excavation hero asked. Hatsum and Class 1B stared at their sensei, before starting when the older inventor cleared his throat in obvious expectation. "Oh!" Hatsum shouted, suddenly strangely happy. "I'll go check." The pinkhead skipped over to the dais and eager hopped aboard, brushing by midnight as if the pro wasn't even there. The seductive heroine might have been insulted had she not been warned about the young woman's obsession with inventing. The chance to tear apart someone else's creation without the threat of reprimand must have been a special treat for her. "I apologize for this," Powerloader said, bowing slightly to his muscular co-worker. If nothing else, the excavation hero was a true gentleman, and believed in accepting what shame he believed his suggested oversight had caused. Likewise, Vladking was also a man of manners, when he wished to be, and easily offered his friend a kind response. "Don't worry about it," the blood hero replied, waving a dismissive hand at the device being poked and prodded by the overeager Hatsum girl. "It's not like it's consuming too much of our time." Having been standing around doing nothing but observing the back and forth going on around them, Class 1B finally reached the end of their patience and began to impatiently whisper amongst themselves. Luckily for them, their sensei couldn't be bothered to parcel out the many low-toned conversations going on. At the dais, Hatsum abruptly managed to jimmy open a panel on the side of the mysterious device. Instead of an accomplished bellow of triumph, the pinkette let out a startled yelp at what she found inside. "Uh-oh. Sensei! Sensei!" Hatsum's uncharacteristically panicked shout instantly drew the attention of all present. Powerloader whipped around from where he'd been speaking to Vlad King. Trying and failing to keep her face passive, the singular support student attempted to whisper her next words. "It's a real bomb." Needless to say, subtlety had never been Hatsum's strong suit. Everyone present heard her loud and clear. Not even a second later, the pro-heroes leapt into action. "Vlad! Midnight! Get the other students to safety!" Powerloader shouted, first to take charge. The two other pros swiftly agreed that the excavation hero should take the leadership role. This sudden situation was closer to his ballpark than theirs. "Hatsum! Don't move!" Powerloader's celerity was all for naught, however. Before either of the UA staff could get a single member of Class 1B to break from their shock at the sudden turn of events, the mechanic cylinder hitherto resting innocuously upon the dais powered on without a sound. Ominous red lines bled from either end of the device, up and down drawing thin trails of sharp edges and shapes. When the lines met in the middle there was a single pause. With a muted hiss, the cylinder shot out open 8 circumference pipes. Immediately, pink mist began to billow outward from the metal tubes, expanding alarmingly quickly. Neither pro nor student was able to even scream or shout in surprise before the entirety of the intersection they'd been standing in was completely enveloped by the rosy fog. The sound of bodies collapsing to the ground echoed throughout the square for a few moments as, without even the hint of a struggle, those gathered blacked out. Undetermined time later, location unknown. Ugh. Izuku woke with a slight headache, her groggy vision blurring her surroundings. Blinking rapidly, the redhead was soon able to make out the walls of whatever room she'd woken up in. They looked to be those of one of UA generic testing site buildings. At the very least, she hadn't been kidnapped off of school grounds. What happened? Groans and murmuring were the only answer to the class president's question. Forcing herself to sit up, Izuku turned to the side, catching sight of Kanoko and Reiko. The two girls looked just as disoriented and out of it as she felt. Off on the other side of the room, Yasetsu Oase and Juzo Hanuki seemed to be having trouble coming to completely. Juzo had managed to lose his helmet. "Is everyone alright?" Izuku asked loudly, instinctively taking as much control of the situation as she could as she pushed herself to stand up. It was slow going, but soon enough the other 4 heroes in training gave affirmatives as they shakily got to their own feet. Allowing her friends a few more moments to gather themselves, Izuku began to think on their new situation. She'd been first in her line, and had had one of the front row seats to the unsuspected bomb's activation. So what had she seen, and how could that help her keep herself and her classmates safe? It was clear to Izuku that they'd been gassed, the redhead assuming the mist had been a strong tranquilizer or narcotic agent. Once unconscious, their attacker or attackers had clearly moved them. The class president's headache grew more prominent as the worst question possible reared its ugly head. Why? What was the motive of whoever had attacked them? Shaking her head, Izuku took in the room she'd woken up in. To her surprise, upon closer inspection, she and her group weren't actually in a room, but one of the central halls of a testing building. Class 1B had used one before in their first battle trial. The familiarity did little to assuage the redhead's nerves. There was no indication as to what floor they'd been left on, nor which of the many buildings of ground gamma they'd been deposited in. Just as Izuku decided to ask her companions for their thoughts, an unfamiliar whirring sound began to echo through the hall, its source slowly approaching. From around the corner floated a drone. One look at the flying robot and the 5 heroes in training almost simultaneously felt ill enough for their stomachs to literally clench. How could a simple machine strike such fear into the hearts of Izuku and her friends? The drone's body was a metallic facsimile of a skull. One of its eye sockets was stuffed with a small, red glowing lens, giving it the appearance of staring forward. Which would make sense, given that the lens was most likely for a camera used to guide the machine's movements. The other eye socket was also taken, this one by an even larger lens encircled by a focus ring. The drone rotated in place, its glowing eye and black eye staring down the 5 students who'd by now slipped into guarded stances. Taking them in, the drone shifted in the air again, silently, and pointed its face toward one of the hall's empty walls. A different type of whirring purred into existence, and then with a click, the drone's larger eye began to project an image onto the wall. Izuku felt her stomach drop to her feet and ice take root in her veins. What stared back at her and her classmates was a disconcerting and frightening sight, to be sure. Donning what looked to be a yellow trench coat with its hood raised, a humanoid figure greeted them. Instead of a normal face, the unknown wore a full iron mask that followed his facial features, only angular to the point of being minimalistic. The disguise seemed to gaze outward with a judgmental mien. To complete the intimidating look, soulless, black lenses prevented any chance of getting a read on the man or woman staring back at them. Salutations, students of UA. The voice that issued forth from the drone was highly synthesized and heavily accented. It was level and clear, almost somber. Just the same, the clearly foreign villain's simple greeting caused a shiver of fear to rack the 5 heroes in training. You may call me a Sawi, and I want to play a game. Mind racing, Izuku immediately filed the name away in her head. Unfortunately, the redhead couldn't recall the image before her matching any villain shown on the national database. She didn't even try to place the voice. Your capture was meant to lure All Might to me, Asawiak continued, adding alarm and anxiety to the 1B students' already growing confusion and fear. What kind of idiot intentionally provoked the symbol of peace? Fortunately for you, the fool hasn't graced us with his presence yet. Izuku could barely keep herself from collapsing. This was it. This was exactly like what had happened at the USJ. It had taken an entire afternoon of girl talk, but Momo had eventually revealed exactly what the purpose of the invasion had been. The frozen redhead felt her throat close up. The bad feeling she'd had since waking up had just gotten a hell of a lot worse. Why had this psycho said fortunately? While I wait, I've decided to give myself a bit of entertainment, the foreign villain revealed, neutral as ever. You each have a chance to save your teachers. And the extra. As soon as the drone finished relating the announcement, the image it projected changed. What was once a singular figure cut to a split-screen view of the pro-heroes who'd been with Class 1B earlier, and Hatsune, tied to chairs by chains. Each beaten and battered captive looked far worse for wear, to the point they appeared ill. To be sporting, I divided you all into groups of 5, Izuku said, unintentionally sending waves of relief rocking through Itsuka's body. She now knew her classmates, her responsibility as their class president, were alive. For now. The game is simple. Find a hostage and liberate them. That is the only way not to die. Itsuka felt her heart stop. From the corner of her eye, she saw Reiko move to support Kanoko, who'd almost collapsed. Yasetsu and Juzo had paled so much they both appeared as if they'd never even heard of the sun. This couldn't be happening. Of course, quitting isn't an option. The obviously insane villain trailed off, the silence building an ominous suspense. Any attempt to do so will result in the complete elimination of all players. Hostages included. Whatever relief Itsuka had felt at learning of her classmates' survival died a final death as the enormity of the situation crashed down upon her. This villain, from out of nowhere, had just declared with complete solemnity that he intended to kill them. And then the class president's subconscious completed a terrible bit of math and forced it to the forefront of her mind. There were 5 hostages. There were only 4 groups of students. Now my new little Mishi. The presence of the unfamiliar term did little to hide the slight uptick it was said with. Whatever the word had been, Izuku had smiled while saying it. Meet your Cody. Itsuka had thought her blood couldn't freeze any further, but what appeared on the drone's projection next chilled her to her bones. Her classmates' gasps and dry heaving indicated they felt the same. Nevsta. Painted upon the wall in splashes of light was the slender figure of a woman wrapped in a pitch-black diver's suit. Instead of a regulator and mask, the villainess wore a skull face mask with an opening carved into it where her mouth would be. But what horrified the members of Class 1B the most wasn't what the woman was dressed in, but who was with her. Sprawled out at the feet of the villainess, held up by the hair in the woman's cruel grip, laid a feminine teen dressed in gothic rock attire with elongated earlobes. She'd been beaten so badly her face was barely recognizable, and there was far too much blood covering her. Itsuka belatedly realized the unmoving girl was a member of Class 1A. And then the redhead finally comprehended the fact that the gothic rocker's stomach had been sliced open, and her intestines were leaking out of a gaping wound. Rosalie. The projection changed before Itsuka could even whimper at the reality of the last image. Now, the scene before the distraught 1B members was focused on a tall and lithe villain who was clad in an oversized yellow raincoat, hood raised. Covered as they were, it was impossible to discern if this new antagonist was male or female, and the now familiar skull-shaped mask only added to that difficulty. The nondescript villain had their arms raised, strangling a twitching figure held off the ground with their head out of frame. From what little Itsuka could see, the victim, dressed in green with long dark hair, appeared to have feminine curves and frog-like feet. The impossibly long tongue, limply hanging down into the shot from above, left no question in the redhead's mind. It was another member of Class 1A. Besnia. Again, the scene changed. And again, Itsuka and her group were exposed to a terrible sight. This time, the villain, while dressed the same as the last, was much smaller, appearing to be a midget of some type. This one stood before a giant metal barrel, filled with bubbling acid. There was an arm sticking out of the dissolving solution, imploring for rescue, that would never come. Sela. Another change of scene, and another villain dressed in genderless garb and mask appeared. The new villain stood atop a teen with the head of a raven, wielding a metal pipe that was jabbed into the male. The boy's feathers were smoking, and he appeared to be in the middle of a seizure. But the attack looked wrong, as if the writhing body wasn't moving as a body, attempting to resist forced movement would. It was as if the raven-headed teen, another member of 1A Itsuka noted, was already dead. The class president of 1B heard someone, Oase or Juzo, begin to vomit behind her, but she couldn't bear to turn away from the sight before her. The reality of their situation was crashing down upon the 5 heroes in training with brutal force. They were facing off against murderers. Murderers who'd already taken out some of Class 1A, the ones everyone said were so strong. The ones who'd survived a full-on villain assault on the USJ. "Do try and entertain my Tovarishchi," Asawik said, the projection cutting back to the villain's expressionless, masked appearance. "You have until All Might arrives. Das Videnaya." Abruptly, the projection cut off, drowning the hall in darkness after such prolonged lighting. In the shadowed gloom, Izuku stared wide-eyed at the drone, which continued to stare impassively at her and her friends. Feeling a spark of sudden fury, the redhead activated her quirk and smashed the machine. It was only after she was wiping scrap off her hands that Izuku cooled down enough to realize she'd also managed to keep the drone from transmitting their location back to their pursuers. Small victories. What did he mean by that? Kanoko stuttered out pitifully into the dark, the mushroom girl's nerves completely shot after everything she just witnessed. The sudden change, the sudden danger, it was almost too much for her. What happens when All Might AA arrives? Izuku and Juzo, who'd apparently not been the one who'd vomited behind her, as Yasetsu was still wiping his mouth in the corner, exchanged glances. Silently, the class president and recommendation student came to an agreement. "We need to move." Juzo's ability to pack his sheer determination and courage into that simple statement did a good job at displaying one of the many reasons why the macambrely grinning teen had been offered his recommendation. His calm demeanor, no matter how thin it truly was, allowed Yasetsu and Kanoko to breathe just a little easier. "Right," Izuku agreed, tone commanding and sharp enough to instantly set her as the leader of the group. Her natural charisma and apparent of wisdom has always made it easier for members of Class 1B to follow her plans. "First, we need to reorient ourselves. I think we're still in ground gamma, but where exactly is what we need to know." Pausing a moment, the redhead looked at each of her classmates, ensuring that each one agreed with her course of action. Receiving 4 silent nods, she continued. "Let's get to the roof," Izuku proposed, tone instilling the suggestion as a command. "From there we can decide what to do, and where to go." As the group moved, quickly coming to a stairwell, Kanoko didn't fail to notice her question had been completely ignored. So, to herself, the mushroom girl answered. When All Might arrived, they would all be saved. Right? On guard every step of the way, the group of 5 slowly made their way up each floor of the building. Every corner, every shadow had become suspicious, a place for ambush, and, more than once they found themselves with their hearts catching in their throats as strange noises echoed through the empty halls. After 10 flights of stairs, and 3 times longer than it had taken during the battle trial, Izuku's group managed to reach the roof. Opening that last metal latch and pushing the door open, the 5 heroes in training actually felt like they'd managed to accomplish something. "We made it!" Yasetsu nearly shouted, barely keeping it to a whisper under threat of being heard by the villains hunting them. Unimpressed with his classmates' overreaction to merely getting outside, Juzo carefully stepped over to the edge of the roof. Peering out, the softening user turned his gaze toward the direction of Ground Gamma's entrance. "Yasetsu-san," Izuku said, causing the active teen to straighten up stiffly, "keep an eye on the door. If you even think you hear something, scream." Limiting himself to a mock salute, the Ravnet took his station. Satisfied, the class president walked over and stood beside the recommendation student. Left without orders, Reiko and Kanoko took up positions on another side of the roof, taking in the surrounding area in hopes of finding traces of their fellow classmates, or a route to safety. "So, what do you think?" Izuku asked lowly, glancing at Juzo. Even with mostly frozen facial features, the grinning teen managed to pull a worried expression. "Something isn't right," Juzo answered, just as hushed. It was clear to him that Izuku didn't want to worry the others if at all possible. "This all seems too elaborate. That Asawik guy had us All of us, but then lets us go so he can toy with us? Izuku shrugged. She'd had similar thoughts while they trekked up the stairs. And since he's the one who placed us here, he knows where we are. How's that hunting? Juzo raised another good point. As they spoke, something began to buzz at the back of Itsuka's mind. She was missing something. They both were. Her companion crossed his arms as he pushed on. If you're going to go through the effort, why not change the setting? Or have his subordinates there when we woke up to start the chase immediately? Logic dictated that there had to be some reason for a villain as obviously intelligent, but clearly deranged, as Izuku to have done things the way he had. He'd shown himself to be clever enough to cover his voice and face. Hell, they didn't even know if the psycho really was a man outside of the deepened pitch of his voice, so what was the point of this hunt? And why use a drone too? As the words trailed from her mouth, Izuku was struck in the heart by a horrifying realization. Whirling, the redhead grabbed onto Juzo as she felt her legs nearly give out from under her. The grinning teen grabbed onto his class president without question and offered his support. He'd come to the same conclusion she had. Juzo-san. I think. Izuku started, we're being recorded. To lure out All Might. Juzo finished, nodding solemnly. Thud. The sudden noise, followed by Kanoko's terrified scream, caused the two high-caliber students to snap around. They immediately wished they hadn't. Yasetsu, once standing by the doorway to the stairwell, was now laying on the ground, unmoving in a growing pool of liquid crimson. Over their downed classmate, masked face blank, stood the villainous Nevsta. The woman still had her arm out, blade in hand stained red. Reality crashed into Itsuka's whirling thoughts, devastating the redhead beyond belief. Nausea and despair gripped her, threatening to drown her as the class president finally realized how terribly true their homeroom teacher's words had been. They weren't ready for this. They were just easy pickings. The villainess tilted her head to the side silently, mockingly acting as if she were confused by their reactions to the sight of their murdered classmate. The sight lit a fire in Itsuka's belly, the ice in her veins, melting enough that she was able to temporarily push down her despair and slide into a combat stance. The redhead swore to herself that she'd avenge her fallen friend, and protect the ones who were still with her. A single step. That's all Itsuka managed before Juzo threw his arm out to block her path. Class president. Take Kanoko-san and Ray-chan, the recommendation student said, grim determination settling over his shoulders. You three need to get out of here. Boobant. Kanoko tried to object, but couldn't force the words out. He lied, Itsuka said, hating that she had to shatter the mushroom girl's threadbare hopes. Izuku never intended to let us go. They're going to kill us anyway. Kanoko sobbed, burying her face into Reiko's bosom. The expressionless Sylvette inhaled sharply, but otherwise refrained from acting besides wrapping her arms around her distraught friend. The still silent villainess took a step forward, seeming to understand what the students had just said. Reacting instantly, Juzo slammed his hands onto the rooftop and pushed everything he could into his quirk. Part of the roof transmuted into a semi-solid state, sinking inward almost immediately afterward. The result created an oblong hole in the process that stretched all the way to the encroaching villainess and split the roof in two. Run! Juzo shouted, even as he almost collapsed from overstressing his quirk. The grinning teen had never pushed softening so hard before, or tried to force it to completely collapse what he was using it on. But he'd done it. Even as he heaved for breath, the fledgling mudman heard the girls as they passed by him and jumped from their roof to the next building over. They'd escaped. Juzo stood, trying not to shake as he took in his opponent. He knew the villainess probably beat him in experience. The way she moved, stalking him, almost screamed that the woman wasn't new to this type of fight. As she leapt back to avoid the reach of his softening, the hero in training thought he might be able to buy his classmates a few minutes if he focused on keeping the huntress stuck in one spot. Then Nevsta pulled a gun, and Juzo realized this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Same time, another unknown location. Kuroro-san. As the seconds ticked by, and her black-themed classmates still failed to return to them, Shiozaki felt her soul grow heavier and heavier with remorse and guilt. She'd been the one to suggest their group's present course of action after all. But sending their classmate, whose quirk allowed him the ability to merge with anything black-colored, had seemed like a good idea at the time. There'd been an abundant number of shadows in the dilapidated parking structure they'd woken up in, more than enough to provide their classmate with multiple options for a tactical retreat in the event he was somehow discovered by the villains hunting them. He should have been fine. But now Shiozaki couldn't help but wonder, in a dark corner of her mind, if the villains had prepared counters for their quirks. Maybe he found a way out? Shota, often referred to as Class 1B's conscience, asked. The brunette was turtling hard into the high collar of his hero costume, more than a little nervous about the situation he and his class found themselves in. A beastly scoff to the plump boy's side announced what the tallest member of their little group thought of such an idea. "Are you perhaps suggesting Kuroro-san ran away?" Shishida asked, his deep voice carrying more concern than honest annoyance. "Do you honestly believe a hero in training would abandon their comrades like that?" It was an ugly thought, Shiozaki agreed, but it was a possibility. They were suddenly facing unknown villains, who strove toward terrible motives, and appeared to carry a real drive to murder them all. Despite Asaweek's threat, the notion of escaping the madman's game would have been an all-too-sweet song for anyone not to consider. She had, however briefly. No. Shota denied quickly, voice vacillating between fear and hope, but if he saw a chance to get help from the outside, then it would have been the best course of action if he'd taken it. Yes. Shiozaki returned to the conversation. If Kuroro-san did indeed attempt an escape, let us pray he was successful in his endeavor. Her companions nodded, putting their hopes into her words. The vine-haired teen sighed, continuing forward. When they'd first woken up after the attack, Shiozaki had taken up the role of team leader, a position she'd dreamed of since she'd left the orphanage, moved to the church, and first learned what heroes were. It was a cruelty in the extreme that she couldn't enjoy her accomplishment in the current crisis though. Shiozaki wished with every fiber in her being that Kendone had been separated with them. Kuro will be successful, don't worry guys. The sudden supportive cheer of Manga Fukudashi was clearly the teen's attempt at raising the spirits of his teammates. Besides, with his quirk, it's impossible for villains to get a hold of him. Hearing it said out loud somehow made the idea of Kuroro's invulnerability more believable. One last time, the members of Shiozaki's group nodded at the assertion that their classmate was fine and on the way back to them. The black-themed teen not only had the best chances of escaping pursuit, but also the best defense against being captured. He would be fine. Of course, you are right Fukudashi-san, Shiozaki agreed, joining the effort to brighten the mood. The group turned one last corner, the last inclined to exit the parking structure. After all, how could anyone catch, let alone kill? It should have been impossible. Words died in the throats of the heroes in training as they took in the sight that awaited them at the gates of what should have been their salvation. Kuroro was hanging down from the ceiling above the entrance, a thickly insulated electrical cable wrapped around his neck. The black-themed teen wasn't moving. Shock numbing their minds, and the three teens could do nothing but stare dumbly at their murdered classmate. This reality couldn't be true. Kuroro couldn't be dead. Stomachs churned, knees weakened, and hearts rocketed into songs of fight or flight. It took over a minute before any of them could find their voices. No. What? Shiozaki's lost any remaining hint of calm facade, beginning to crack under the weight of their discovery. How? She hadn't wanted this. Kendone could have the leadership role forever. She no longer wished to carry this burden. She'd had someone's life riding on her shoulders, her decisions, and her orders had led to that life being extinguished. Shiozaki nearly retched. She might as well have committed the murder herself. She had sinned. She had terribly, horribly sinned. Shiozaki-san. Shiozaki-san. Iba-chan, calm down. Shishida's roar, harsh though it may have been, came with gentle arms wrapping around the plant-themed heroine in training. There is no time to mourn our friend right now. We must away from here. And quickly. The beastly teen, whose glasses were fogging due to the tears spilling from his eyes, was correct. Releasing his temporary team leader, Shishida glanced over to a trembling Fukudashi. Fukudashi-san, please lend me your aid in getting Kuroro-san down. Still twitching, the comic teen quickly moved to assist. While the two stepped away to complete their grisly task, promising to be as respectful as possible, the beastly teen hoped their leader would take the time to gather herself. I don't understand. Manga muttered, his speech bubble-wobbly. How could they have gotten him? Slowing to a stop before their hanged classmate, both teen realized neither had the fortitude to actually touch the corpse. Hey Shota-san. What do you think? Fukudashi asked. The silence that answered was strange. Normally their big-boned classmate was quick to respond to anyone who asked him something. Shota-san? Snap. Shiozaki, Shishida, and Fukudashi whipped around at the sudden, impossibly loud and sickening sound. Collectively, they gasped in horror. Rosalie, the tall monstrous villain clad in a yellow raincoat and skull mask, the one who they'd seen strangling a member of Class 1A only a short while ago, had found them. The source of the snap was easy to discern, as nauseating as it was. Their heavyset classmate, poor Shota, hung, limply, from the villain's raised arms like a sack of flesh. It was abundantly clear to the remaining heroes in training. They'd just lost another classmate. They hadn't even had a chance to save him. Was this the villain that had taken down Kuroro? Run! Shiozaki's scream echoed through the parking structure. It wasn't the most heroic option, but in the moment, her classmates obliged her orders without question. Scrambling back the way they'd come, the three remaining heroes in training descended back into the depths of the parking structure. It was the worst path they could have taken, but panic had clouded their judgment. Realizing this, Shishida took a chance, a sudden, desperate idea popping into his panicking thoughts. With a roar packed with impotent rage and rising terror, the beastly teen reared back a fist and let it fly. Crash! The innocent wall crumbled, and by the grace of some watching deity, it wasn't more brick or rebar that was revealed, but hallway. Shishida had found them a new escape route. As they fled down the newly discovered hallway and their minds had a chance to settle, the cowardice of their retreat began to gnaw at the egos of the heroes in training. Finally reaching an intersection, the group chose a room off to the side that had a door with a lock, and took a moment to catch their breath. Nervously, Fukudashi glanced back the way they'd come. Seeing nothing, he glanced back again. What the comic teen had seen as he and his group had taken the discovered hallway was burned into his mind, and it made resting impossible. And if the others had seen it, he knew they'd be in the same boat as he was now. As they'd left the parking structure behind, the monstrous Rosalie had dropped Shota's corpse like it was nothing. Without missing a beat, the villain had then simply started walking after them. The image would forever be burned into the back of Fukudashi's eyes. Meanwhile, another unknown location. The group that had originally consisted of Ndo Monoma, Setsuna Tokaji, Senkaibara, Uekodai, and Togaru Kamakiri had split. While on paper it was a fundamentally terrible idea, to them their reasoning had been somewhat sound. The math just hadn't added up. 4 teams, 5 hostages. If every team could only take 1 hostage, that meant 1 would be left as sacrifice. And that just wasn't heroic. Asawik had never said anything about further dividing teams, so Monoma and Tokaji had come to the conclusion that separating was allowed. At the request of the blonde egoist himself, the lizard-loving teen had taken both Kaibara and Kodai with her, leaving only their insectoid classmate behind. She'd wanted to fight the decision, but Kamakiri had brusquely told her to butt out and get lost, so she had. It was a tactical decision on Monoma's part. The hater of Class 1A was certain that a recommendation student would be able to make much better use of the other's quirks in a fight. He hated to say it, but mid-battle strategy was one of his weaker skills. He was much more adept at stealth, quick strikes, and misdirection. Call him a coward. But Monoma saw himself as a cunning coward, who wanted his classmates to have the best chance of succeeding, and surviving, as possible. Now, the blonde and his aggressive classmate were doing their level best to scout the building they just entered. As luck would have it, the front gate of the structure had still been lowering back down when they'd come upon it, indicating recent use. Their advance proceeded relatively quickly. Kamakiri was quick with his step, and kept his eyes peeled for enemies. Monoma, likewise, kept a discerning eye on the lookout for positions of possible ambush. Whenever a mezzanine or atrium appeared overly suspicious or dangerous, the blonde would tap his classmate's shoulder and the two would progress much more cautiously until the area was cleared. Taking a left at the latest intersection they'd come across, the duo suddenly found themselves in a most convenient of positions. The midget. Kamakiri's whisper fell like leaves in the wind as he peeked around the corner. Bending his arms, large blades grew from the insectoid teen's forearms as he activated his quirk. "What's that villain doing?" Monoma whispered back, taking a peek himself. The blonde gently placed a hand on his classmate's shoulder, copying razor-sharp as the two had previously agreed. The diminutive villain, Pesnia, appeared to be completely engrossed in the laptop resting on the desk they sat at. While neither student could discern what was being typed, or watched, they both knew that if they could capture the villain, they had a chance at turning this whole nightmare around. Information was the maker or breaker of war, and while killing the villain was almost too tempting, Monoma wanted to teach these scum a lesson. Don't mess with Class 1B. We have to strike to kill, Kamakiri hissed, eyes hardening as he continued to watch their target like a hawk. Monoma started. The blonde almost instinctively objected, but then realized he was in no position to do so. Even if they beat Pesnia into submission, they had no capture tool, or time or talent to interrogate the villain. So much for the pen being mightier than the sword. "I'll charge first," Kamakiri said, slipping back and turning to face Monoma. "You jump in a second later, in case that bastard somehow dodges my attack." Monoma gulped, but nodded in understanding just the same. Just because he'd come to accept that killing the villain was likely their only option, that didn't mean the blonde's stomach had come to accept the same without twisting and churning. "Don't strike to kill," Kamakiri added suddenly, taking in his partner's growing pallor. "All you need to do is corner the villain. Or serve as a distraction. I'll carry the heavier burden." With that unpleasantness settled, both teens agreed that now was the time to act. Monoma stood at the ready by the corner. Kamakiri crouched. In a flurry of motion, the insectoid teen leapt forward, charging around the corner as silently as the predator he resembled. Monoma swung around the corner a second later, calculating that his companion was a single step from their target. Readying his borrowed razor sharp, the blonde clenched his gut and, "GGG-ka-ah." Kamakiri's scream brought Monoma up short. The blonde stared in fascinated horror. They'd made a rookie mistake. In their rush to defeat their target, they'd forgotten to check the room for traps. A wire net on the floor, connected to an electrical outlet, had stopped the insectoid hero in training in his tracks. And now he was being electrocuted without mercy. "Kamakiri!" Monoma shouted, only succeeding in drawing the attention of Pesnia from the laptop. The diminutive villain rose from their seat, smoothly drawing a gun with a silencer attached from a holster strapped to their chest, under the raincoat. Suddenly, the electrified trap shut off, allowing its victim to collapse to the ground like a lifeless doll. Without a word of warning, Pesnia took aim and fired 3 shots into the unmoving body. If he'd been able to move his body at all, Monoma knew he would have run. He should have run. Why wasn't he running? Too late, the blonde lifted his gaze to glare at the villain who'd murdered yet another student of his class. Staring into the soulless lenses of the skull-like mask, the copy user saw only his own reflection. There was no remorse. No mercy. Slowly, the outfoxed student raised his arms, a clear sign of surrender. He'd been beaten. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. 1B was supposed to be able to, still without saying a word. Pesnia pulled out another gun, also silenced, and shot the blonde without missing a beat. Itsuka Kendo's group, unknown location. When Itsuka, Kanoko, and Reiko had jumped to the roof of the building next to them, the three hadn't expected the flooring to be so thin and frail. The shoddy construction collapsing from under them as soon as they'd landed had also been unexpected. At least they'd managed to land in a pool. For that they were grateful. Not so much that the pool's water turned out to be murky in nature. Gah! Kanoko cried as she surfaced, coughing up a mouthful of dirty water. The brunette bit back a curse as she realized her costume was now beyond saving. Why would they keep an unclean pool here? Reiko rose horizontally from the pool like a ghost, employing her quirk on herself to exit the murk as quickly as possible. At least it helped break our fall, the ghostly teen said, prying off her face mask. While her voice remained as monotone as ever, giving no hint as to the heroine-in-training's annoyance, internally the Sylvette was drowning in worry and grief. Attempting to center herself, Reiko focused her mind on regretting how easily the material of her face mask retained the disgusting smell of the dirty water. The simple thoughts somewhat helping the Sylvette ignore the fact that she'd just left. No, she couldn't waste time thinking about him right now. Are you two alright? Itsuka asked, pushing herself through the pool with sweeps of enlarged hands. Quickly, we need to move on before that monster catches up to us. It pained the redhead to admit, but their sensei's earlier words really did hold true. They weren't ready to fight against real villains, especially the psychotic and murderous types. Nevsta. That was the name of the masked horror Asawik had unleashed to hunt them down. Taking a precious moment of their escape time, Itsuka took what scarce information she had and analyzed it. The easiest to start with was the villainous outfit, because those had been feminine curves she'd seen, no doubt. The villainess had worn what appeared to be a military-grade diving suit. Additionally, a harness had wrapped around her body, carrying a number of gun holsters. The handles of blades had stuck out from their sheaths strapped to her back. The skull mask and hood had made distinguishing any facial features impossible, but the way she'd moved, the lack of speech, the almost lackadaisical way she chased after them. Nevsta was clearly a predator who was toying with their inexperience. It was a long fall, Reiko stated, breaking the silence. The ghostly teen floated toward her class president, Kanoko, holding on to one of her feet and towed behind her. Do you think Juku, Hanuki-san is alright? Any answer was interrupted by a rather soft thud, only heard due to the silence that still enveloped the girls. Itsuka blinked. That had sounded like it had landed right in front of her, at the edge of the pool. Leave me alone. Itsuka's scream echoed in the darkness as the redhead flailed as hard as she could in the opposite direction, crossing the width of the pool in seconds. The class president refused to look back until she'd hit and scrambled up and over the edge of the pool. Splash! The strangely ominous sound finally forced the usually level-headed teen to look back. Quickly. Kanoko, Reiko, before. The warning died in Itsuka's throat as she gazed out at the pool. She'd finally escaped. A smattering of bubbles. Disturbed water sloshing to and fro. Neither of those sights captured the redhead's attention so much as the slowly growing patch of crimson at the center of the pool. Kanoko and Reiko were nowhere to be seen. And Itsuka was pretty sure that darkening stain in the water was right below where Reiko had been floating. Then, Nevsta's head emerged from the middle of the crimson, staring directly at Itsuka through soulless black lenses. Na-oo-oo. The redhead scream caught in her throat as she fled the pool, dashing away from the monster that had killed her friends in cold blood as quickly as she could. Blinded by unshed tears, 1B's class president stumbled into a locker room. Slamming into every obstacle along the way, Izuku managed to pry open a locker. Hating herself for what she was about to do, the hunted redhead crawled into the metal closet and closed the door behind her. Alone, but for who knew how long, Izuku finally allowed the tears to fall. Again. She'd failed to protect her classmates, her friends, again. Guilt and self-loathing devoured the once proud class president of Class 1B, even as she desperately hoped her hiding place would allow her a few moments of rest. God, please, somebody help. Back at the pool, Kanoko and Reiko breached the murky water for a second time, gasping for breath. Nevsta had literally jumped on the two, dragging them down to the bottom of the pool and nailing them down to the flooring with two knives the villainess had stabbed into their costumes. Both girls had panicked more for their class president, who was no doubt their attacker's real target, than themselves. Thankfully, it was apparent that the villainess didn't know the extent of their quirks. Reiko was able to use poltergeist to pull the knives free with little issue. After painfully opening her eyes while under the dirty water. Gah! Bleck! Kanoko spat, coughing up the brine that had managed to get in her mouth. I think I drank some. Yuck! Pushing through the strain of using her quirk so freely, Reiko lifted herself out of the water again. Taking hold of Kanoko's flailing hand, the Sylvette slowly hovered her way to the pool's edge. Where is Itsuka-san? Reiko asked flatly, seeing the deck area empty of life. And why? Why is the water red? Pausing in the air, both girls looked at the other. It couldn't be. But the thought, once born, wormed its insidious way to the forefront of their minds. Had the villainess already gotten their dear class president, their friend? The red in the water caught their eye again, taking on a whole new meaning with Itsuka's absence. Choking back screams, lest they garner the attention of the murderous villainess hunting them. The heroines in training crash-landed at the edge of the pool. Scrambling to their feet, the two swallowed back the bile threatening to crawl up their throats. Tears streaming down their dirty faces, Reiko and Kanoko fled the pool deck on shaky legs without looking back. They knew, in the crushing silence that followed them, that they were next. Back in the locker room. Having finally managed to get a handle on herself, Itsuka, uncharacteristically timid, gradually opened the locker door that was the only thing keeping her hidden from the roving, murdering villainess. Truthfully, the redhead had halfway expected the silent killer to be waiting right outside the locker for her. She didn't know if she was relieved or not to find the locker room empty. I'm sorry. Itsuka murmured into the suffocating quiet. It was her fault. Juzo. Reiko. Kanoko. She was responsible for the deaths of all her friends. I'm so sorry. As she'd cowered in the locker, Itsuka had been unable to ignore her failures. She could have used her quirk. She could have used her hands and her martial arts to keep the villainess occupied while her friends escaped. Sacrificing her hands, or even her own life, would have been preferable to the agony that was gripping her heart at the hands of her guilt for surviving. I'm going to take her down. Itsuka swore, psyching herself up for what was about to come. I still need to find a way to contact the outside for help. If we could just call All Might. Fatigue causing her steps to wobble and pitch, the battered class president of 1B made her way back to the door, leading to the pool deck. Whoever had built the structure they'd fallen into had put the only way out opposite of the locker rooms, and now the redhead was regretting even more her life choices. Shaky hands pressed against the latch that worked as the entrance's doorknob. To the redhead's frustration, her quivering limbs seemed to almost resist opening the damn thing. Finally, with a grunt, the door was shoved open. Peeking out, Itsuka felt her stomach drop for the umpteenth time. Twin trails of crimson fluid led from the pool to the pool deck's exit. 1,000,001 thoughts flashed through the redhead's studious mind as she took in the gruesome sight. The possibilities were nearly overwhelming, but two stuck out the heaviest. Either her classmates had somehow survived grievous wounds, and fled, or had the villainess dragged their waterlogged bodies away, back to her leader? Both scenarios were nauseating. Walking outside, The tiny flicker of hope Izuku had been unable to keep in check flickered. There was no sign of her friends. No. Why? Why was she spared? Why she was basically ignored? What was the point of torturing them like this? They were just students. Izuku had said he wanted All Might. Did he really think their suffering would bring the symbol of peace to him? And how did that monster think he was going to kill the #1 hero? If an engineered super soldier monster couldn't do it, what could? A bioweapon? Bioweapon? Kanoko. A fresh wave of gut-wrenching horror struck Izuku like lightning. Momo had said that she'd heard from Masui that the monstrosity at the USJ had somehow had multiple quirks. If some villain had managed to devise a way to harvest quirks and use them separate from their original users, what was to say that sort of technique couldn't be used to empower a bioweapon? Izuku froze. Izuku had never said what his quirk was. What if he could do something similar to Monoma? Or worse? TSK. The sudden, sharp sound startled the class president so abruptly that she couldn't even scream, her body locking up. The pain in her chest felt like her heart was stopping. Stiffly, stone-like, Izuku turned around. After everything she'd been through since waking up earlier, the terrified expression she wore was understandable, even though she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of the redhead's neck rose, goosebumps covering her skin as an indescribable feeling of being watched fell upon her. Giving in to the new feeling of paranoia, Izuku whirled around frantically. Wherever that sound was coming from, she needed to know. Now. TSK TSK. Izuku nearly screamed. The eerie sound, like a tongue clicking, came again and again, and she still couldn't find its source. Wait. Hadn't Nevza moved, almost like those ninja from her dad's old movies? What was it he'd always said? Nobody ever looked up? Snapping her gaze upward so harshly she almost cracked her spine, Izuku peered into the gloom above caused by Ground Gamma's overcrowded skyline. There. Maybe? Above the door she'd just come out of, the redhead thought she could see something. Internally, her mind was screaming that there really was something there, but her eyes persisted in refusing to believe it. The conflict worsened, and Izuku took a tentative step forward to see if less distance could give her an answer. Was that a line in the shadows? It sort of looked like something there didn't mesh completely with the rest of the wall. Izuku squinted her eyes, SPLU. Splat. Just to have something gooey strike the teal orbs. The redhead reared back with a scream, immediately blinded. Then the burning, searing pain kicked in. It felt as if her eyeballs were melting. Waves of agony shot through Itsuka's body as she cringed back. Desperation set in, and the suffering class president did the only thing she could think of. Activating her quirk, the redhead grew her hands to their maximum size, swinging them around, wildly as she continued to shriek. Izuku didn't know what the villainess would plan next, or if the killer would simply wait for whatever she'd thrown at her eyes to run its course. Whatever came, the redhead sure as hell wasn't planning on making things easier for her opponent. TSCK. The suppressed report of a silenced gun was nearly drowned out by the screaming of the blinded class president. The redhead's cries suddenly cut off as she dropped to the ground, lifeless as a puppet with its strings cut. Back with Shiozaki's group, unknown location. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. The harried words bounced against the plaster walls of the small supplies shed the group of 3 heroes in training had chosen to hide in as Shiozaki repeated the mantra over and over again. The vine-haired teen had to wake herself up from this nightmare. Shiozaki-san, calm down. Fukudashi said, lightly shaking the young woman by the shoulders. The comic teen was successful in at least gaining his classmates' fraying attention. I know you're scared. I am too. But we need to stay calm and get out of this. Together. For our friends. The heroine in training stared back at her bubble-headed classmate and noticed that the emoji signifying Fukudashi's face were shaky characters she'd never seen before. The comic teen was also trembling so much she could feel it through the hands on her shoulders. It took a few calming breaths, But Shiozaki was able to eventually regain enough composure to straighten up right. Yes, you're right, the vine-haired teen managed, willing her fear and guilt down until it could be handled later. Now was the time to plan, not wallow. Shishidaku-san, what can you tell us about our enemy? The beastly teen gave only a sigh in reply. Out of their remaining group, it was logical to assume his more animalistic senses would have a far easier time picking up clues from their pursuer than the others. However, I failed to sense a single thing, Shishida admitted, sagging. Alongside his wild combat ability and intellect, the beastly teen had always been proud of his detecting ability. The revelation of its failure had hit the hero in training hard once he'd had time to process it. It's likely a result of our foe's quirk. No scent, no sound, not even a change in temperature. Most concerning of all, our enemy exudes not one iota of killing intent either. They are a shadow to me. The disheartening information was not what Shiozaki had been hoping to hear. The idea that an assassin with such ability and self-control was hunting them down only spelled more trouble for the surviving members of Class 1B. They could be taken by surprise at any moment, and be dead before they even knew to be afraid. So, a powerful masking quirk, Shiozaki finally summarized, moving on to get a better handle on the situation. How the vine-haired teen wished Kendone was still there. Even Monoma would have been able to outmaneuver their pursuer better than she could. At least it's not super strength or, Lord have mercy, an offensive emitter type of some sort. Rosalie. Fukudashi suddenly added, sounding unsure. I think that's the name of the one that's after us. It's hard to tell, they all look mostly the same. Huddled together in the gloom, the three remaining members of Shiozaki's group thought back to the presentation they'd been forced to witness by the deranged psychopath who'd ambushed and kidnapped Class 1B. Asaweek's manner of dress had been frightening enough, but when the projection had cut to the villain's minions, each of the subordinates had been terrors of their own. Between the three heroes in training concentrating on remembering what they'd seen, they were able to confirm Rosalie had been the largest of Asaweek's servants. Unfortunately, besides murdering a member of 1A, there was nothing else recalled. The villain had given no discernible clues as to their ability, or even their gender. Something has been bothering me, Shishida added, concentrating with a fierce mien. The beastly teen was clearly attempting to connect dots that refused to be tied together. Asaweek. I believe I've heard that name somewhere. That gained the attention of his two classmates for sure. Shishida-san. I need you to try and remember where you heard it, Shiozaki said firmly, towing the line between requesting and demanding. Even so, the hopeful tone permeating the vine-haired teen's words showed how much a potential weakness meant to her. It might be the only way we gain a lead that will help us vanquish these villains. While his two classmates pored over their knowledge of recent and historic events, even dipping into international news reports, Fukudashi took a step away. The comic teen leaned against one of the shed's dirty walls, keeping an eye on the door as well as his brainstorming friends. That name. Asaweek. It sounded strangely familiar. However, unlike Shishida and Shiozaki, the comic teen knew he'd been far less studious when it came to anything regarding villain attacks before being accepted into a. That meant that if he remembered hearing the villain's name somewhere, it wasn't from the news, class. Fukudashi shouted, catching the attention of his comrades. Asaweek. We heard that name in class, not the news. Shiozaki's fair brows furrowed, the vine-haired teen casting her mind back to every lesson Class 1B had gone through since the first day of school. Was he from a case study? Shishida asked, the beastly teen also thinking hard on every lesson he and his classmates had been to. Every homework assignment they'd been given. Would that mean that this is all revenge against one of the pros that teach us? Shiozaki asked, attempting to narrow the possible culprits responsible. No, Fukudashi said, certainty deepening the comic teen's voice. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a case study. Then it clicked. The masks shaped like skulls. The oddly specific sounding names of Asaweek's lackeys. The villain's last words. Das Widenaya. I remember. Fukudashi shouted, an endorphin rush popping the comic teen's head bubble into a spiked starburst. Asawik is, crash. Twin arms clad in the yellow sleeves of a raincoat burst through the plaster wall Fukudashi had been resting against, caging him in. Before the comic teen could even scream, he was pulled back into the cloud of debris kicked up by the surprise attack. Crunch. Before either Shiozaki or Shishida could react, the sickening sound froze them stiff. The remaining students felt their stomachs sink once again. They knew in their bones they'd just lost another classmate. Then, the villain Rossley slowly entered the shed from the thinning cloud of debris. Fukudashi-san. Shiozaki whimpered. She hadn't known her comic-headed classmate all that well. She wasn't like the charismatic Kendone, who could memorize names, quirks, and even personalities in a single day, but that didn't mean she didn't feel terrible for his death. It was her failures that had gotten her group into this situation, her sins that had cost them their lives. We have no choice, Shishida stated, stepping in between Shiozaki and the approaching villain. The beastly teen was seeing red, the slow ponderous gait of their enemy only making him angrier. We will have to fight. Shiozaki flinched back at the stoic declaration, her every instinct railing against the idea even as her mind was dragged toward the truth of it. Boobant. My blessing. The vine-haired teen stammered, body and mind rebelling. It's only meant to be used to protect and save the innocent. Even as she spoke, Shiozaki felt a pit of guilt open in her soul at her words, her excuses. Her entire life, she'd believed in the beauty of Mother Nature, and that the gift bestowed upon her at birth had been a sign. She'd been meant for the life of a pacifistic heroine, one that preached to the masses to embrace peace. That lifelong belief had been one of the reasons she'd chosen the dress of a Grecian goddess as her hero costume, why she'd never used her gift for any purpose that could harm another. She couldn't afford to dirty her hands with sin if she were to lead the people to salvation. And now that belief was going to get them killed. Then I will keep this villain occupied while you escape. Shishida roared, hulking up into a truly enormous beast. In this form, the hero in training easily towered over the encroaching Rossley. In muted horror, Shiozaki watched as her protector launched forward and threw himself at the villain. She looked on as the murderer hardly so much as flinched at the sight of the oncoming beast. She gazed, wide-eyed, into the soulless lenses of their pursuer, the reflective glass failing to convey any form of human emotion. And she stared, shocked, as the villain effortlessly caught Shishida's clawed hands in their own as if it were nothing. Impossible. Shiozaki muttered, the sight of her classmate being pushed back, his massive size counting for nothing, almost too much. It wasn't supposed to be super strength. AGH. Shishida, still swollen with the power of his quirk, snarled as Rossley snapped out a fist and struck him across the face. I kill you. Dead. Unable to fully process the fact that he now had a broken nose, the beastly teen swung a fist low, managing to connect the strike with a satisfying crack of something breaking. And yet, the villain again refused to even flinch. While the two titans began to trade blows, Shiozaki realized this was the chance to escape that her classmate had put himself into a fight for his life for. As the vine-haired teen inched toward the shed's flimsy door, part of her agreed with her course of action. Getting help was a priority. She wasn't cut out for front-line fighting anyway. Another, harsher part, demanded the heroine in training stay and cease allowing her friends to die. Rare. Wham. The meaty sound of a body striking an immovable object forced Shiozaki to turn and look back. Her flickering hopes of seeing Shishida-kun standing victorious were thoroughly crushed by the sight that greeted her. In a move that must have been too quick for the beastly teen to follow, Rossley had managed to grab the hero in training by the neck and slam him against the wall, the shoddy plaster cracking around his enlarged body. The tall villains seemed to enjoy strangling their victims. No. The words hardly carried from Shiozaki's gasping lips. The vine-haired teen rooted in place due to the impossibility before her. Shishida-kun was In terms of raw power, the strongest member of Class 1B went in the thralls of his quirk. Even Tetsu admitted to losing an arm wrestling match against the furred teen. For him to be defeated, they'd never stood a chance. Run Dadibacha. Shishida wheezed through his collapsing trachea. The desperate plea added further weight to Shiozaki's crushed heart. Rosalie reared back at first and struck hard. With the same ponderousness the villain had showcased when pursuing them earlier, the beating began. Each punch was a surgical strike to Shishida's solar plexus. After one, the beastly teen was spitting up saliva and choking. A second brought him to hacking up blood. After three the hero in training could no longer hold on to his quirk, and deflated. "Let him go!" Shiozaki shrieked, finally reacting. Flinging an arm out, strands of her hair vines whipped out and wrapped around the arm Rosalie had been using to pummel Shishida. With a dark thought, the restricting vegetation sprouted wicked thorns, impaling the villain's captured limb. Rosalie paused, turning to look at the new combatant who'd entered the fray. The villain's head tilted to the side, silent confusion, a mocking commentary on how much of a threat the vine-haired teen was considered. After all, what did she hope to accomplish? I said. Whatever Shiozaki had meant to say went unsaid, as Rosalie finally reacted. As expected of one gifted with superior strength, especially when pitted against someone who'd foregone proper anchoring. A simple yank of the vine-entombed arm was all that was needed to lift Shiozaki off her feet and pull her forward. When the now panicked student had been drawn stumbling into range, the villain then swung again. The strike hit Shiozaki so hard the vine-haired teen went tumbling to the floor, reeling at the pain the swift act of violence had left her. The thorns she'd hatefully grown had turned on her as well, scratching lines of blood across her once angelic face. Dazed, it took a long moment before the world righted itself for the heroine in training. When it did, Shiozaki found herself helpless as she watched Rosalie sharply jab an open hand directly into Shishida-kun's abdomen. A sickening spray of blood discharged from around the villain's impaling hand, painting the accursed appendage crimson. Just as sharply, Rosalie pulled back, the murderer taking pieces and bits of the beastly teen's intestines in a tight grip. Shiozaki felt herself shaking. The world darkened at the edges of her vision. She took in Shishida's blank gaze, his cracked glasses doing nothing to hide an expression rife with pain and suffering. Such blatant, careless sadism. It was too much. Too much. Something once indomitably strong but now fragile inside Shiozaki snapped. The screech of fury was nigh unintelligible. Her weariness and fatigue washed away by waves of unbridled rage, the vine-haired heroine in training launched herself at the villain who'd taken so much from her. Unlike her previous attempt, Shiozaki pulled no punches this time. Her blessings, her gift, were now barbed by wickedly sharp thorns, the ends of each capped by serrated points. Remembering as much human anatomy as she could from lessons learned ages ago, the rampaging heroine in training directed her weaponized vines toward every vital point her target possessed that she could think of. God have mercy on this villain, for she no longer felt herself capable. In the blink of an eye, she struck, and Rosalie was nailed to the wall like the world's goriest entomological display. Vines, wickedly thorned, acted as pins and pierced the villain's body. A body that went limp as Shiozaki watched, now, unmoving and unresponsive. A body that was now dead. The shock instantly hit the ex-pacifist hard enough to knock her from her enraged state. Shiozaki fell back on her ass, able to do nothing but take in the sight of what she'd done in the stark light that filtered into the decrepit shed. Denial flooded the vine-haired teen, and she shook her head frantically. Unexpectedly, the jerky movement caused the vines spearing through Rosalie's corpse to crack and break, the vegetation having hardened completely as a result of their wielder's unhinged desire to exterminate her foe. Falling back again, Shiozaki rolled to the side just in time, her stomach rebelling against reality. The bile burned as it rushed up her throat, but not nearly as much as the vine-haired teen felt her soul burning. As she heaved, the heroine in training felt lightheaded, the world threatening to spin out of control. She couldn't get enough air. Were her eyes blurring? Shiozaki had to get away. She had to flee from her sin. Oh Heavenly Father, she'd murdered someone. Taken a life! Before the sight alone drove her mad. Scrambling back, the vine-haired teen found herself unable to take her eyes away from the villain sheet. Shiozaki's hand landed in something squishy and warm. Looking down at her shaking hand, the shattered heroine in training realized what she'd unintentionally touched, a pool of blood and intestines. Shishida-kun's blood and intestines. Shiozaki screamed. She screamed and screamed as she ran. Elsewhere, location unknown. Tetsu, the manliest student of class 1B, would be the first to admit he wasn't one to demand, or even ask for, the role of leadership. He was manly enough to recognize his shortcomings, namely his lack of strategic thinking and logistical intellect, when it came to working with others, and honestly tried to improve them. But he knew he was no Kendone. As such, being appointed leader of his group after they'd woken up from the ambush hadn't been his choice. He wanted that to be known. But the others had followed his lead without issue, some even asking him to step forward, so he had. They trusted him to take point, guide them to safety. Well, he sure as hell wasn't going to disappoint them. Unfortunately for the steely teen, the masked villain he and his group had just stumbled upon, the same villain now blocking their path, was giving him a stark reminder of why he normally preferred to leave leadership to others. Just one of you? Tetsu spat, hoping his bravado would boost his group's morale. You really think you can take us all on? The villain remained unresponsive, only moving both arms upwards laterally so dual weapons could expand from under oversized sleeves. The pair of telescopic batons clicked into place, sparks of electricity running the length of the metal bludgeons. Be bad man. To be dangerous. Pony Tsunatori stuttered out, doing her best to communicate through her broken Japanese. The tense atmosphere was making the exchange student's language problem even more difficult, but she pushed through her frustration. What do we to do? Tetsu chanced to glance back, taking in his weary group. Kojiro Bondo was trembling, his seven-eye spout things tearing up with his quirk's glue-like substance. Kozai Tsuburaba looked doubtful, the Solidaire user clearly not liking their chances against an unknown foe. Neither member of Class 1B had shown much skill as frontliners, and the steely teen knew involving them in a fight was a big no unless otherwise unavoidable. Pony stood to the left, her large eyes watery but resolute. The blonde was ready to back him up if Tetsu needed her, which was nice. Lastly, the steely teen locked eyes with Class 1B's other exchange student, Rin. Are you electricity resistant? Rin asked, his Japanese better than Pony's although still stilted and accented. Thankfully for Tetsu, he knew the Chinese national had been doing what he couldn't, analyzing their opponent. Hoping the ponytailed teen had a plan, the steely hero in training nodded confidently. Of course I am, Tetsu boasted, activating his quirk on his arms. The muscled steel gleamed as he flexed. I won't feel a thing. I'm grounded for anything less than a lightning strike man. Rin nodded, eyes hardening as he took a stance. Then, when I faint, you go full frontal. Scales rippled down the Chinese teen's arms and up his neck, giving off a very draconic vibe. With an ease that surprised himself, the steely teen realized he knew exactly what his classmate had planned. He was going to be the lock that would keep the villain immobilized long enough to disarm. Tetsu felt his blood begin to fire up. They were going on the offensive. Good plan, Tetsu said with a nod, turning to Pony. Pony, be ready. Once I engage, use your quirk with everything you've got. But you take hurting. Pony cried, understandably worried. Tetsu's honest smile only slightly relieved the blonde's concern. Don't worry. Tetsu said, allowing his quirk to activate. His now iconic transformation flowed over him like liquid silver, turning him into a living statue of steel. I can take it. A sudden Repetitive breathing noise came from the villain, returning the attention of the members of Class 1B to the task at hand. With a final, resolute nod to each other, the heroes in training moved to put their plan into action. Rin darted forward as Pony planted her feet wide and lowered her head. Tetsu psyched himself up for the wrestle of a lifetime, and took a step forward. They were ready for this. They were combat specialists. This villain, whose weapons pointed to being the one called Sela, wouldn't stand a chance. However, no plan survives first contact in battle. Pritarok. The shout was synthesized, foreign, and genderless, but the insult was clear as the masked villain suddenly dashed forward. With inhuman speed, Sela reached Rin before the Chinese teen could build enough momentum. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the martial artist could only watch as the villain raised both sparking batons overhead to bludgeon him. Sheer instinct kicked in, and the hero in training broke form to throw his arms up and shield himself. He braced for impact and electrical discharge. The attack, however, came from below. URGK. Rin's groan rose an entire octave as the Chinese teen slumped to the ground, pale and unresponsive. The kick to his genitals had been incredibly underhanded, but extremely effective. True to villainous form, Sela had decided to take out target number 1 with a strike to the male body's weakest point. The villain's heavy boot had managed to accomplish what Rin's opponents in Class 1B's battle trial hadn't, taking the martial artist out with a single strike. Tetsu, Banto, and Tsuburaba collectively winced as feelings of empathetical pain coursed through their own bodies. Even Pony looked on aghast at witnessing such brutal attack. The hesitation cost them. Coldly, Sela raised both batons and brought them down on the paralyzed Rin, shocking him with enough voltage to cause a seizure. The Chinese teen convulsed under the assault before collapsing limply. The martial artist didn't get back up, or make any further sign of life. He just laid there, unmoving, without even so much as a twitch. "You bastard!" Tetsu charged forward, confident in his quirk's ability to protect him from such tactics. The steely teen would take his physical advantage and use it to pummel this villain scum into the dirt. He'd avenge his fallen comrade and protect his friends. Taking the challenge head-on, Sela charged as well, using Rin's body as a springboard. The two titanic forces soared toward a climatic finish, only for the villain to shift at the last second and shove a shoulder into Tetsu's steely abdomen. The hero in training felt his center of gravity change, before he realized what was going on. Helpless to counter, the steely teen was forced to follow as his momentum carried his upper body up and over. Another shift from Sela, and Tetsu had to brace for impact as he was thrown bodily over the villain. Temporarily free of interference, Sela immediately charged against a frozen pony. "You! Stop now!" the equine teen shouted, firing her horns. Unfortunately, inexperience caused the heroine in training to mistime her attack, and the villain got in too close, too soon. UGH. Pony bent over double, her stomach hit full force by Sela's heavily booted foot. The villain had dropped to a slide, completely evading the equine teen's airborne projectiles before delivering a devastating kick. In an incredible act of strength and gymnastic talent, Sela punched the ground to twist into a handstand, only to roundhouse kick Pony in the head once in position. The hurting girl ragdolled, the sheer force applied to the kicks enough to leave her dazed as she rolled on the ground. "Leave her alone," Tetsu shouted, having recovered just enough to watch as the cute girl was mercilessly pummeled. Scrambling to his feet, the steely teen jumped to the rescue. The repetitive breathing returned, and Sela turned to face the incoming human missile. Hero in training and villain reached to engage in a powerhouse brawl, except there wasn't. Tetsu threw punch after punch, aiming to take down the nearly silent villain with a single hit. Unfortunately, the steely teen's righteous fury and untrained fighting style left his strikes slow and heavily telegraphed. Sela, on the other hand, appeared to focus more on evading, lightly tapping the metal-bound hero in training with one or both batons when he couldn't retaliate and it was safe to strike. The villain's movements were smooth, fluid, and well-practiced, a deadly dance expertly enacted. Anger rising at his failure to land an attack, Tetsu hardly realized his thoughts were clouding. Unable to pick up on how his opponent was guiding him around the battlefield, the steely teen launched himself forward time and again, until he tripped on Rin's body. What the? When no retaliatory strike came, Tetsu looked up in bafflement at the sudden change of pace. The steely teen found himself in the perfect position to watch as his villainous opponent stood over a new target. Head. Hurts. Oi. Pony, only now recovered enough from the brutal hit that had sent her rolling, didn't immediately realize the danger. It was only after a shadow rose up from behind her that the equine teen chanced to look up, and saw the villain now standing over her. Dual batons sparked. Umrit, Sela uttered. The word was menacing. Not a war cry, but a declaration. To her credit, Pony did her best to avoid the strike. The equine teen didn't know how potent the villain's batons were, but she knew based off what had happened to Rin she didn't want to be hit by them. Flinching, the blonde prepared for the worst. Only for her vision to be obscured as powerful, metallic arms wrapped her in their firm embrace. Pony. Tetsu shouted, determined to save the cute classmate in his arms. He'd made it though, and now she was safe. The manly teen felt the batons tap his steeled back. Pony's scream was the stuff of nightmares, reverberating in Tetsu's ears like a banshee's wail. Electrical sparks flew through the air unbidden. Belatedly, the steely teen realized the horrible truth. Steel might have protected him from electrocution, but it also made him a conductor. The girl in his arms was being tortured in spite of, no, because of, his efforts. Finally, the batons lost charge, and the flow of electricity tapered to a stop. Shaking, Tetsu realized the blonde in his arms was no longer moving. Pony? Tetsu lightly shook the equestrian girl. Prussian blue eyes did not open to meet his own. A comfortingly sweet voice did not call out to him. Pony didn't respond at all. Still relegated to the background, Saburaba and Bondo gasped in horror. The two felt guilt flood them. Being deadweight was not what they'd applied to be, but their bodies were frozen stiff in fear. They couldn't move. Pritarok. The foreign word, spoken again, was followed by the repetitive noise that the villain had made twice before. Only now, the heroes in training realized what the sound was. Laughter. As gently as he could, Tetsu lowered the blonde in his arms to the ground. Letting her go, the steely teen rose up, glaring directly into the soulless lenses of the masked villain. Mirth. Bloodlust. Disappointment. Tetsu somehow knew these were what his opponent was feeling, even though the skull mask still obscured their face. But it didn't matter. He'd had enough. Screw fair treatment, and screw getting expelled. He was going to break every bone in this freak's body, and avenge his classmates. Tetsu roared, charging once more against the villain who had taken two of his classmates, his friends, away from him. The steely teen let go, no longer mindful of his superhuman strength or the morality of using his quirk as he was. He attacked with reckless abandon. Sela evaded the swinging arms of the enraged Sylvan like flowing water, always just out of reach. Twisting around, the villain finally struck out and nailed the steely teen in the temples, stunning him, before repositioning behind him. Wrapping both arms around the hero in training, the masked murderer executed a perfect German suplex. The move was forceful enough to bury Tetsu's head and shoulders into the ground, leaving the steely teen's legs to flail uselessly in the air. With that annoyance dealt with for the moment, Sela turned toward the terrified duo that had done absolutely nothing so far. The two so-called heroes in training were cowering now, the sight of a villain advancing on them too much. Shock batons engaged, held at the ready. Tetsu frantically struggled to free himself. He didn't have time to be stuck. His classmates were in danger. Neither of the boys would stand a chance alone. On top of that, he needed to get Pony and Rin to safety. They couldn't be dead, please no, so their wounds had to be severe to be so unresponsive. The Sylvette could only hope that Saburaba could keep an air shield up long enough for him to free himself. "Yuaa!" Tetsu shouted as he finally managed to forcefully unbury his head and shoulders. Shaking off the lingering head trauma, the steely teen looked for his remaining classmates. And dearly regretted doing so. Both Saburaba and Bondo were sprawled out on the ground, blood covering their chests, and splattered all over the ground. Rin's talisman-like visor was coated in blood, the characters once prominent no longer visible. Sela stood alone, a looming shadow over Pony's immobile form, with a silenced pistol in hand. The elongated barrel was aimed at the defenseless heroine in training's head. No. Tetsu, for the first time in his life, felt the paralyzing grip of utter fear and despair. "Please. No." Sela turned to the shaken teen, soulless lenses secreting away whatever dastardly emotion the villain felt at achieving such a complete victory. Then, without looking away, fanfare, monologue, or any sign of remorse or hesitation, the murderer fired. TSCK. Several times. TSCK. 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 Small gouts of blood splatter rewarded each suppressed shot, although none so much as dirtied Sela's yellow raincoat. Pony remained as unmoving as before, but any hope of the equine teen surviving the day had died. Just as she had. "Bispolzny Malchik," Sela said plainly before laughing that hoarse, breathy laugh. Then, apparently satisfied, the villain simply walked away. Unspoken but clearly delivered was the message. The remaining hero in training wasn't even worth the effort. Tetsu stared at his dead classmates for what felt like an eternity. His manly heart had been broken, his steely resolve lost. His failures, not only as a hero, but as a man, stared back at him for the world to see. He'd been one of the loudest of Class 1B demanding a chance at action. But it was now clear to the Sylvette that he was nowhere near ready for the real world. And his classmates had paid for that inexperience. A single tear slipped free from his thick eyelashes. Standing, the shattered hero in training hardened his resolve. Stealing his body, Tetsu raced after the villain that had taken nearly everything from him. He swore as he ran, he'd avenge each and every one of them. And if he was arrested for murder afterwards, then so be it. Ground Gamma, Central Building, Structure P4RT4. Setsuna Tokaji had known her instincts had been right on the money. There was no way that the leader of a cell of villains brazen enough to attack us students wouldn't use this specific building as a center of operations. It was too grandiose. Luckily, she'd woken up with her classmates Senkaibara and Uekodai, whose quirks had come in handy in infiltrating the structure, undetected after she'd convinced them a surprise attack was their best chance. And after silently traversing empty halls for what felt like hours, the trio had finally found the despicable Asawik in the penthouse suite. Like she'd said, typical villain. "Are you ready?" Setsuna whispered to her classmates, keeping an eye on the big bad as he stared out of the wall-length window of his suite, the main room full of metal canisters. The quiet duo nodded in affirmation. The idea was simple: if they took down the leader, they'd both win and save everyone in one fell swoop. A quick glance around the suite had shown that besides the numerous canisters littered about, a large metal case, a laptop, and the desk the two former sat on, there was no indication of any other objects in the room or that Asawik was armed or had defenses of any kind in place. This was going to be easy. "Let's go." Utilizing their element of surprise, Setsuna announced their arrival loudly as she charged the front door, hoping to throw the villainous mastermind off. Kaibara and Kodai quickly followed. Snap. Tha thump. The moment she passed through the entryway, Setsuna knew she'd fucked up. Ow. Whipping around, The reptilian-loving teen was powerless but to watch Kaibara and Kodai scream bloody murder as their bodies convulsed under the electrified capture net trap their brash entrance had set off. While the forest green Verdanet had avoided the snare, her classmates hadn't been so lucky. After only a few seconds of torture, the trap exhausted itself, and the flow of electricity frying Setsuna's friends died away. The two collapsed, unmoving, to the ground, leaving the recommendation student alone against the leader of the villains who'd attacked Class 1B. Did you truly believe I would be so unprepared? That I wouldn't plan for one of you to think to come after me? Asawi asked as he turned to face the lone heroine in training. Or that your every move wasn't being observed since the moment you entered this place? Setsuna blinked, the corner of her eye catching sight of the laptop she'd seen earlier. Focusing on the device, to her shock and horror its screen was cycling through camera feeds, all of which were focused on each place she and her team had gone through after entering the building. The reptilian-loving teen cursed. She really had forgotten that the entirety of testing sites, like Ground Gamma, were covered by surveillance systems. The frustrated recommendation student grit her teeth at the rookie mistake that had cost her and her team. She'd been Was the big bad checking her out? If the tilting of the villain's mask was anything to go by, he was at least taking in her suit. Well, Asawi was still a male. It made her skin crawl, but Setsuna could make that work. Her costume had turned out slightly sexier than originally intended anyway. Might as well use any advantage she could get. I'm pretty sure I've got plenty more surprises left for you, big boy, Setsuna finally said, clamping down on the urge to vomit at her words. It was just an act. It was just an act. Putting on her best salacious smile and bedroom eyes, hiding all her fear and revulsion as she did so, the reptilian-loving teen put her hands on her hips and posed provocatively to showcase her budding hourglass figure, growing breasts, and slim thighs. Now why don't you come over here and, I wasn't aware the prestigious UA endorsed prostitution. Asawi cut through Setsuna's attempted seduction with cold words and a judgmental stare she could feel even through the villain's mask. The stark admonishment caused the heroine in training to flinch. Are you a heroine or a harlot? Should I draw my gun on you or my cock? Truly I am undecided. The crass words, though spoken mockingly through the villain's synthesized voice, were nonetheless weighted with threat. Setsuna swallowed thickly as she realized her second mistake. While she might have enjoyed acting the role of dirty-minded flirt while in battle, just the thought of this villain actually putting his hands on her made the reptilian-loving teen almost panic. What the fuck had she been thinking? Observing the anxious pallor of the now paralyzed student, Asawi snorted in amusement, the contemptuous noise butchered by the villain's synthesizer. Fear not, girl. For now, there's no need to fear for your virtue. Asawi said, a mutilated chuckle following the assurance. The deranged villain obviously found something funny. That is, if you still even have any. Instantly, Setsuna felt her fear and anxiety die in the face of utter rage. The gall of the villain blew through much of the recommendation student's clear thinking and right into her shit list. The lone heroine in training was pretty much raring to beat her enemy to a pulp now. You talk too much shit for a scumbag within striking distance. Setsuna shouted, leaping into action. It's over. Unlike her classmates, this particular recommendation student of Class 1B had an ace up her sleeve. The reptilian-loving teen had the basics of a super move ready and waiting to test out. Using her quirk, Setsuna split her body into sections, her arms, legs, head, and torso separate entities set to attack. Her target remaining stationary gave the heroine in training a confidence boost. The villain didn't even know how to handle her bizarre attack. Perfect? You are correct, Asawi drawled, it is. Without warning, Setsuna felt her control of her satellite limbs falter and disappear. The separated body parts fell to the ground, completely numb, although her head unfortunately felt the full impact. Asawi, who the recommendation student was only now beginning to realize was a villainous mastermind, took only 3 steps before reaching her detached head. Carefully, almost lovingly, The psychopath lifted the scattered heroine in training up, turning her in his hands like a misshapen ball so that she was forced to look directly into his frightening mask. The villain even went so far as to brush the reptilian-loving teen's forest green hair out of the way so that her sight wouldn't be impaired. What did you do?" Setsuna whimpered, terror trembling her voice and threatening to lock her jaw. "Me? Not a thing," Asaweek replied, absolutely calm as he stared into his captive's eyes. "You are the one who brazenly rushed into a room, filled with an active airborne bioweapon." The insane leader of the villains tilted Setsuna's disconnected head to the side so that the heroine in training could take in their surroundings. It was only now that the recommendation student realized that each and every canister in the room was labeled with the yellow and black biohazard symbol. No. But that means. Setsuna could hardly breathe. It was only after her frantic thoughts finished connecting all the dots that she felt able to try and speak again. From the very beginning. There, now, at the edge of the end, literally in the hands of the enemy, the heroine in training finally understood. The gas that had knocked Class 1B and the teachers out had been Asaweek's bioweapon from the start. Her entire class had been condemned before they'd even woken up. The entire rescue operation game of their captor had been nothing more than a front to study his weapon's effects so as to better utilize it against All Might. "You were already dead, yes," Asaweek confirmed, walking over and setting Setsuna's head down on the desk next to the laptop. The simple words reverberated deeply within the heroine in training's displaced heart. The recommendation hardly had a chance to accept her inevitable death, before another shock hit her. "That is, unless I give you this antidote of mine." Setsuna's eyes instantly zeroed in on the tiny vial that was set before her on the desk. It glowed a venomous green. "To be honest, you intrigue me, Setsuna Tokaji. Your quirk is versatile, unusual, and strong beyond measure," Asaweek said, stepping into Setsuna's limited view. The impartiality of the supervillain's mask for once contradicted the inflection that had entered his words. "It's also absolutely wasted as it is now, being taught by damaged and weak heroes." The supervillain paused, tenderly caressing the dark hair of the recommendation student. If Setsuna could have flinched away, she would have. Being forced to take the touch would haunt the reptilian-loving teen for weeks to come, if she lived that long. "Pledge yourself to me, Setsuna Tokaji. Become a participant in my experiments to create the next generation of world leaders." Asaweek's instability became clear the more he spoke, though his tone never wavered and he remained as stone-cold as death. "Our combined genetic creations would be amongst the most brilliant and resilient inheritors of the world. Nothing would stop them, heroes, villains, governments. Nothing." The true meaning of the supervillain's offer wasn't lost to the captive heroine in training. Asaweek wasn't just inviting her to join the bad guys. He was propositioning her to enter into a quirk marriage with him. "I know you'll make the right choice," Asaweek said, cutting through Setsuna's desperate silence and dragging her attention back. "Just as my dear Nevsta did not so long ago." For a singular moment, Setsuna felt her shock, fear of death, and pride as a future heroine wage an honest-to-God total war within her. Thankfully, the victor prevailed quickly. "Fuck you." Although the recommendation student had managed enough willpower to grit out her answer, the fact that she'd even considered the other offer disgusted her. Regardless of whether or not another had accepted it, Asaweek's offer made the reptilian-loving teen feel filthy just thinking about. "I believe that opportunity has passed," Asaweek quipped, taking Setsuna's head and dumping it into an empty canister that had been sitting under the desk. "But if you insist, have it your way then." The last thing Setsuna would see would be a grenade dropped onto her head. Boom. Once silence had returned to the room, Asaweek sighed heavily. Shaking himself and straightening, the supervillain walked over to the metal case he'd been saving and opened it. Inside rested an assembled heavy sniper rifle. "It appears to be time for Galu by season. Ground Gamma, Main Street." The gates were in sight. There was no denying it. They'd failed to find even a single hostage, but escape was possible. And yet, Kanoko and Reiko found themselves extremely hesitant. The two couldn't muster the courage to leave their guarded hiding spot tucked away in an alley. "We just need to get over there," Reiko stated, monotone as ever. Even drenched to the bone and scared out of her mind, the ghostly teen expressed little to no emotion. "How are you holding up, Kaino-chan?" The Sylvette had purposefully used a pet name she knew her shorter friend hated, hoping to elicit a response. Unfortunately, the one she got was not the one hoped for. I'm fine," Kanoko replied stiffly, looking a ghastly mixture of petrified and disheveled. We need to hurry up though so we can save Kendone and the others." If she were the type, Reiko would have sighed. Her friend was losing it, seemingly stuck in denial. But she just couldn't bring herself to drag the traumatized girl back to reality. Not yet at least. "Whatever you say, Kaino-chan," Reiko said instead, leaning around the corner slowly. She didn't have the best night vision, but she still had to try and see if she could make out Nevsta's shape lurking in the shadows, anywhere. "Wait. Isn't that Ibara-san? With short hair?" At Kanoko's sudden exclamation, Reiko spun around, feet even leaving the ground temporarily in her haste. Cobalt orbs flickered over the industrial wasteland that had become their prison, searching feverishly for signs of their vine-haired classmate. If they could join up with anyone else, then their chances of escape would exponentially increase. When she found her, Reiko was almost glad she couldn't sob at the sight of Shiozaki that greeted her. The once always calm and collected girl looked ragged and unhinged, vine locks short and uneven. The girl looked to be aimlessly stumbling forward with no clear destination in mind. "Ibara-san." Only a decibel or two below shrieking, Reiko couldn't help but notice Kanoko's tone of voice sounded somewhat hysterical. "Shiozaki-san." Reiko raised her voice as much as she could, the Sylvette hoping that 2 consecutive shouts would prove to their staggering classmate that she wasn't hallucinating. Luckily, that seemed to be the case, and Shiozaki began to look around for who'd called out to her. When the vine-haired teen spotted them, her devastated mien rose, morphing into one of hesitant hope and joy. Unable to help herself, the ex-pacifist began to jog in the direction of the first friendly faces she'd seen in a long time. "Komari-san. Yanagi-san." If Shiozaki sounded somewhat broken as she screamed their names, neither heroine in training deigned to mention it. What mattered was that they had finally found a friend. Flush with a giddy sense of hope, Kanoko snagged one of Reiko's ever-draped hands, and yanked the Sylvette behind her. Before Reiko could object, her teary-eyed friend had pulled her from their cover. That was a mistake. Boom. The sudden roar followed a blinding firework of light that bloomed from the side of the head of the overzealous mushroom-themed girl. When the unexpected flash had receded, Kanoko was already sprawled on the ground, a massive splatter of crimson liquid drenching her. The unexpected violence shouldn't have surprised her, not after today, but staring down at the unmoving figure of her friend, after everything they'd already been through, was too much for even the stoic Reiko to bear. "Kaino-chan." The Sylvette murmured, total defeat wrapping an icy fist around her throat. The ghostly teen took a single step. Boom. Shiozaki froze, now staring at the blood-soaked corpses of both Yanagi and Komari. Tears came unbidden to already flooded eyes. This was her fault too. If the two hadn't seen her, hadn't called out and realized how broken she was, they wouldn't have come out of hiding. They would still be alive if she'd just disappeared. The vine-haired teen swallowed thickly. She was no messiah of life and peace, she was only a harbinger of death and pain. Taking a last glance at the wide-open gates, Shiozaki gave up. It wasn't worth it anymore. She'd lost everything. The ex-pacifist allowed exhaustion to take her, and gratefully embraced the emptiness of unconsciousness. In her despair, the once proud heroine in training had one last thought. If the villains took her, at least then her cursed existence would lead to their deaths. Such a wicked idea was the closest thing to a happy thought that Shiozaki could muster before everything went black. Sometime later, Ground Gamma, dark room. Izuku cracked her eyes open. The redhead had been awake for some time now, 15 minutes or so, but had only now felt the waves of searing agony that had pulsed through her entire body originating from the poisoned orbs ebb away. Realizing she could think and focus again, the martial artist had turned all of her willpower to keep herself from groaning and remaining completely relaxed. It had paid off. She'd been left alone, and as far as she could tell no one had come to check on her. The villains hadn't even tied her up either, meaning they hadn't expected her to awaken so soon. For once, the redhead felt like she could truly move undetected and do something. A prisoner? Another hostage? Why was I captured? Am I the only one? Izuku's thoughts ran a mile a minute as she fought the numb stiffness of her body to stand. The action wasn't only unnaturally painful for its simplicity, it was downright tiresome as well. It was as if a powerful tranquilizer had been used to knock her out, and she was now suffering the after-effects. Maybe the others are around here somewhere too? Izuku consciously fought down the growing hope she could feel viciously trying to take root in her heart. She repeated a single fact to anchor herself to her stark reality. If Izuku had honestly wanted to keep his hostages, he wouldn't have set up his sick game in the first place. There was something more going on here. Legs feeling like fleshy bricks of concrete, Izuku exited the room she'd woken up in and did her best to limp her way down the connected corridor. She had no clue as to where she was, or where Izuku and his lackeys were. It wasn't the best situation, but it could be. She stopped herself from thinking that forbidden thought. The hallway seemed to go on forever, lined with locked doors, but eventually Izuku came upon one that was slightly ajar. Seeing light coming from behind it, the heroine in training gathered what courage she had left, and took a peek inside. She gasped in surprised shock. That girl from the support course. The redhead screamed in her head. The pinkhead was barely tied to her chair, but even so she was hardly moving at all. Closer inspection revealed the inventor in training was in really bad shape, with her skin sallow and eyes dim. Opening the door as slowly as possible so as to avoid discovery, Izuku limped her way to the tied-up student. Who's there? The coarse voice that nearly faded into the silence was so weak it was nothing like the exuberance that the pinkhead had shown at her arrival earlier. Honestly, Izuku was thankful for that. A friend, the heroine in training replied at a whisper once she was close enough. Are you okay? Can you walk? The class president of Class 1B, if it still existed, knew that trying to carry a hostage out of any area where villains still roamed free would be suicide. Hell, even just exiting whatever building they were in now would be impossible. But it turned out the room the pinkhead had been kept in had a window. Even without looking out from it, Izuku could tell the drop wouldn't be too high. Not in this situation. I think so. Hatsune replied, massaging her wrists. I think I just caught a cold or something. Shouldn't have pulled those all-nighters on the Mecha Rex. Izuku forced herself to smile at the flimsy joke. Humor was a good sign, and it wasn't the pinkhead's fault she didn't know about the horrors she'd gone through before getting to her. While Hatsune began to stretch her stiff limbs, Izuku took stock of her situation again. She was on at least the second floor. The entrance to Ground Gamma was in view. She'd found a hostage. An unknown amount of villains were still at large, including their leader Izuku. She had no backup. The plan was quick, easy, and desperate. Izuku would help Hatsune down to ground level with the rope she'd been tied up with. Then, the pinkhead would go for help. Meanwhile, Izuku would stay behind and make sure no villains followed her. Thinking on that last point, Izuku shuddered. She could only guess as to the fates of her classmates, but hopefully Tetsu was still out there fighting. And Shishida had to have taken out at least one of the murdering band of psychos. If she could distract what remained even for a little bit, then Hatsune would be able to escape and report the situation to the school in All Might. Being rescued from this hell sounded nice, but the redhead once again refused to let her hopes rise too high. So, we can leave? Hatsune asked, earning a hard stare from the wrung-out president of what was once Class 1B. "Yeah, you can leave." "Through the window," Izuku replied, ignoring the blank look returned by the inventor in training. "Look, I need you to get outside, undetected, and find All Might." Preparing the rope for the Pinkette's escape was easy to do, and didn't even require looking away from the increasingly confused-looking Hatsune. What? The support student seemed unable to comprehend what was going on. That was okay, it was to be expected of a captive in a hostage situation. They might not always know how dangerous the situation really was. Like now. "There's no time to explain. I need you to run as fast as you can for the gate and get help," Izuku said, putting all of her natural charisma into sounding as convincing as possible. "We all need your help here. Please be quick." The lie burned as it left the redhead's tongue. But was it a lie if she didn't know whether or not there was a we left? The Pinkette finally nodded in agreement, and Izuku immediately felt dirty for lying. But it was necessary. "Oh, okay," Hatsune stammered, hesitant in the way one is when not being rescued after the villain was taken down, but when being rescued in secret. It took only 2 minutes for Izuku to tie the rope to the Pinkette and begin to help her out the window and to the ground below. Then, the redhead heard the door open. Izuku kept a strong face for the entirety of the time she lowered Hatsune to the ground, even as footsteps neared her every second. She managed to keep that stalwart visage as the support student touched down and took the ropes off like an expert. Through a shared thumbs up and watching the Pinkette jog away toward Ground Gamma's gate, she kept that strength. What little hope she still carried in her heart, it all rested on Hatsune's retreating shoulders. Izuku turned to face her fate. Positively. Asawik began a slow clap after speaking, masked face as unreadable as ever. At the mastermind's back stood the villainous Nevsta and the imposing Rosalie. The trio seemed mostly in perfect condition, although bits of Shiozaki's hair could be seen stuck in the latter's coat. The pieces were coated in blood as well. Izuku bit her lip, forcing back a sob. She could guess what Rosalie's state meant for the fate of her vine-haired friend. "It seems at least one of you were able to reach a hostage." "How amusing," Asawik continued, the mask synthesizer making it impossible to discern whether or not the psychopath was being sarcastic or not. "As one who holds value in one's words, I won't kill you." That earned a snort from the cornered redhead. Such a petty sense of honor was utterly revolting. Taking a chance, the heroine in training turned back around and looked out the window, half expecting to see Hatsune intercepted and recaptured. To her surprise, she watched as the Pinkette reached the gate and effortlessly escaped. She'd won. Nothing else mattered now. "It's over, Asawik," Izuku said, bitter confidence filling her with pitched strength she knew was as empty as the satisfaction she felt. "You've lost." "Is that so?" Izuku snapped to attention, finding that the mastermind had somehow gotten right next to her without her noticing. The psychopath ignored her, taking in the sight of the now open gate. "You say that after helping me further my plans so graciously?" Izuku only just managed to keep from stumbling back against the windowsill. She had to bite her tongue to keep from asking for an explanation. This was only the last words of a doomed villain, digging for one last victory before utter defeat. The mastermind regarded the redhead for a moment before a low, warped chuckle forced its way through his mask. "Ah, perhaps you haven't figured it out yet then?" The words weren't spoken as a question. Izuku glared in silent response. Asawik sighed. "And here I believed you were trying to appeal to me so that I would give you the antidote." Izuku couldn't restrain herself any longer. "Antidote?" The word tasted like hash on the redhead's tongue. "For what?" "For the deadly supervirus you just unleashed onto the world, of course," Asawik answered, serenely gesturing toward the gate Hatsune had just escaped through. Izuku paled. There was no way. He couldn't be serious. "I monitored each and every one of you to see who would be the perfect vessel to carry my retribution to All Might and the other self-proclaimed heroes out there," Asawik began, sounding just like a stereotypical monologue villain. Only 2 of you showed the required qualifications. And wouldn't you know it, you came along and so kindly assisted in delivering one of them straight to the big man himself. The mastermind turned to stare right into the despairing gaze of Itsuka Kendo. The redhead saw only her own reflection in the supervillain's lenses, an ironic recrimination for unwittingly aiding a psychopath and killing the symbol of peace. No. Itsuka took a step back, only to trip and fall into the very chair Hatsumi had occupied only minutes ago. You're lying. Even as she spoke the empty words, the redhead knew she was only denying the truth. She tried with every ounce left of her will to bend reality to fit the image of a defeated villain pulling a last-ditch scam. But it made sense. They'd all been gassed. They'd all then no doubt gone through incredibly taxing physical activity fighting Asawi's subordinates. Those same subordinates had all worn sealed masks. Objectively, it really was such an easy way to monitor the effectiveness of a bioweapon. Infect your unsuspecting test subjects, and watch them die as they think they're surviving. She'd been such a fool. By the time Itsuka was able to pull herself out of her self-hatred, she realized she'd been tied to the hostage chair. The furniture piece had been reoriented so that the redhead was now facing the door to the room. There was a new addition to the once empty cell though. A complex set of ropes and hooks had been jury-rigged together, ultimately linked to a shotgun. A shotgun pointed directly at her chest. "What are you doing?" Itsuka snarled out of reflex, perhaps expecting the supervillain to have actually kept his word. "I thought you said, I am a man of honor, I assure you," Asawi said, walking by the bound heroine in training as if she no longer mattered. "I won't kill you." Rosalie, or was that Sela, stepped forward and forced a gag into the captive class president's mouth. Itsuka tried to scream, but no sound of worth made it through. "It's a pity, you know?" Asawi continued, waiting for his subordinates to leave the room before grabbing the door's knob. "If you'd been only a fraction of a percentage more fascinating, I would have given you the opportunity to join me. Just like I did one of your classmates." The hardly veiled insult turned a look of true horror from the now struggling heroine in training. "Oh well," Asawi lamented flippantly, stopping just before closing the door. The mastermind pulled out a device from his coat, a recorder. "I guess I'll just let one of your other classmates do my dirty work for me this time." With those parting words, the supervillain pressed play on the recorder, Itsuka soon recognizing the projected sounds of panic and pain as her own. That bastard had recorded her when she'd panicked at the pool, before her capture. Wait. What was that thrashing, crashing coming from outside? Oh God. Oh no. Outside the room, Tetsu had literally been charging through the length of ground gamma, blinded by inconsolate rage, like a steel bull in a concrete china shop. He'd chased Sela from the moment he'd been able to stand, smashing through windows, walls, doors. You name it. The steely teen couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, until he had the head of the bastard who'd killed his classmates, his friends, in his own 2 hands. Nothing mattered besides vengeance for the wrongfully dead. Sela. The scream, war cry, roar all rolled into one reverberated through Tetsu's head once more. He could feel his anger increase every second. He'd almost caught the bastard too many times to count, only for the villain to slip away with a taunt in a language he couldn't understand. It was maddening. Finally, the chase had taken the steely teen here, to this building. He'd followed the murderer's trail all the way to this floor. He ran down a random hallway, breaking doors open as he ran. There was no way, Gah. A familiar voice, twisted in pain, instantly knocked Tetsu from his rage. "Leave me alone. Kendo ne?" Tetsu muttered, revenge and villains gone from his thoughts for the moment. "Nah-oo-oo." There was no doubt in the steely teen's mind. That terrified scream was Kendo's. And it was coming from behind that door, right there. Tetsu refused to hesitate, not ever again. Quirk activated. The hero in training fully intended to keep any more friends from dying at the hands of these bastard villains. Grabbing the door's knob, The steely teen threw it open with such strength the flimsy faux wood was torn apart, hinges and all. Boom. It happened in a split second, but it might as well have been an eternity for Tetsu. Before he could react, a shotgun fired right into the chest of his class president and honorary big sister. The force of the shot threw Kendo backwards, chair and all. Numb, Tetsu took in the sight of the bloody corpse of Class 1B's big sister. Belatedly, the steely teen noticed the unmanned weapon had been tied to topes that had once led to the door. The door he'd destroyed on his way in. It hit him like a freight train. He just killed Kendo. Him. Not a villain. Him. Unable to cope, Tetsu fell to his knees. Too shocked to think. The steely teen's quirk deactivated on its own. He couldn't take his eyes off her, his dead classmate. He'd done that. His hot-bloodedness, which he'd always taken such pride in, had killed the kindest, most understanding, intelligent, and all-around best big sister knucklehead like him could have asked for. Wrapped in his guilt and grief, Tetsu hardly noticed the villains now standing around him. He definitely didn't notice Seela as the murderer he'd been hunting in the first place stepped up behind him. The villain raised familiar dual batons. Sparks flying. The electrified weapons came down, and the video paused. The lights of the classroom popped on without a sound, revealing the entirety of Class 1B, alive and in their seats, looking as if they'd been beaten to within an inch of their lives. Most of them were covered in a sticky blood-red substance that looked and even smelled like the real deal. A few of the more unlucky heroes in training still had pieces of intestines sticking to them, which upon closer inspection weren't actually real either. Each and every member of Class 1B looked thorough. Heroes in training still had pieces of intestines sticking to them, which upon closer inspection weren't actually real either. Each and every member of Class 1B looked thoroughly chastised and humiliated. So, does anyone here still feel ready to go head-to-head with real villains? Vlad King's rhetorical question had all the connotations of the beginning of a long lecture. The students flinched. It looked like they weren't out of the woods yet. Magnus, you didn't really think I would kill off all these characters in this chapter, did you? The _0 observant 3, hopefully not. We only made it totally obvious this was a test. In other news, please give a warm thank you to Erikias Jogenius for creating Cursed Blood's very own TV tropes page. Go check it out.